When the women of Batty Street broke down the locked door, the air turned acrid with the smell of acid. On the narrow bed lay a young woman, 6 months pregnant, her lips discolored, her skin blistered. Beneath the bed, a man was found still breathing, his face burned by the same poison that had killed her. In that small East End room, life and death lay side by side, one extinguished, one trembling, both trapped in the same silence. London in the summer of 1887 was restless and fevered. The days were dry and hot, the air thick with dust, and the cobbled streets of the East End baked beneath a sun that showed no mercy. The city's poor had no shade, no gardens, and little reason to celebrate. This was meant to be a year of jubilee, a grand celebration of Queen Victoria's 50 years on the throne. The rich prepared their pageants and parades, polishing carriages and stringing flags from tall windows. But in the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, the only banners were the torn washing lines of those who could barely feed themselves. For the laborers, match girls, and costermongers who lived cheek by jowl in rooms no larger than closets, there was little jubilation to be found. London was a city divided by its own wealth, glittering on one side and rotting on the other. The East End was where the city hid its exhaustion, its sickness, and its failures. The scent of damp brick mixed with that of coal smoke and sewage, forming an atmosphere that seemed to cling to the lungs of everyone who lived there. In those crowded streets, men rose before dawn to fight for the day's work, queuing at the docks or workshops with tools in hand, waiting for a foreman's nod. Women waited in shared kitchens for a turn at the single stove, nursing infants who coughed through the night. When the rent man came knocking, voices fell silent, and coins, when they existed, were counted in trembling hands. By June, tempers were frayed. Unemployment was rising and food was scarce. Even the smallest spark, a rumor, a lost job, an insult shouted in the street, could ignite a quarrel. In such conditions, crime was less a choice than a symptom. Theft, brawling, drunkenness, they were the vocabulary of poverty. Violence was common, and the police rarely came quickly enough to intervene. The East End, it was said, policed itself through silence. It was also a place of migration. Tens of thousands of Jewish refugees from Poland, Lithuania, and Russia had fled to London during the previous decade, escaping pogroms and persecution. They arrived with little more than faith, skill, and exhaustion. The East End offered cheap rooms and a chance, no matter how small, to begin again. For many, that chance came in the form of manual trades: tailoring, cobbling, bootmaking, cigar rolling. The work was grueling, the hours long, the pay low. Yet to have work at all was a kind of grace. The newcomers formed their own enclaves, speaking Yiddish in crowded yards and setting up Sabbath candles in rooms that doubled as workshops. But the growing population deepened the tension. To some of their neighbors, the immigrants were competition. Others saw them as outsiders, scapegoats for every shortage and grievance. By the time the hot winds of June arrived, the East End was a tinderbox of fear and resentment, one that only needed a name, a face, or an accusation to ignite. Whitechapel itself was a landscape of contradictions. In the early morning light, the market stalls were bright with fruit and fabric, the cries of sellers echoing through the streets. But behind those colors, entire families lived in single rooms, their walls damp with mildew. Disease spread quietly through the population. Typhus, diphtheria, and consumption took their toll on the weak. Children played barefoot among the refuse heaps that lined the gutters. To walk those streets was to witness a city caught between progress and decay. Gas lamps flickered above open drains. Churches stood beside brothels. The new railways rumbled overhead, while rats scurried below. The Industrial Revolution had brought wealth to England, but not to those who stitched, hammered, and polished for a few pennies a day. It was within this world that a strange, senseless murder would take place, a crime so brutal that even the hardened residents of the East End would stop and whisper about it for years to come. Before the Ripper haunted these streets, before fear became nightly routine, there was another story. A smaller one, perhaps, but no less tragic. In late June of that year, at 16 Batty Street, a narrow turning-off commercial road, life went on much as usual. The rooms were filled with workers, most of them immigrants who had brought their languages and hopes with them across the sea. The house itself was unremarkable. 3 floors, peeling paint, and a small shared yard with a single lavatory. Inside lived a mixture of families and lodgers. Their days were defined by labor, their nights by exhaustion. Among the tenants was a young man who worked with umbrellas, a trade that combined patience with precision. His name was Israel Lowes, though he would later be known by another. He was a quiet man, reserved and industrious, who sent small sums of money home when he could. Those who knew him described him as polite, perhaps melancholy, but never unkind. Like so many others, he had come to England seeking safety from a hostile homeland, only to find new hardships waiting in a different tongue. Life in such lodgings offered little privacy. Every sound carried, every footstep known. A crying infant, a creaking floorboard, a whisper through the wall, each was part of the shared rhythm of survival. Those who lived there knew one another's habits almost by instinct. When the tailor rose for work, when the landlady went to market, when the couple downstairs lit their evening lamp. And yet, amid this intimacy, there was still loneliness. Many immigrants live between languages and between worlds, isolated by accent and suspicion. The boundaries of morality and desperation blurred easily. A kind word might be mistaken for deceit. A moment of anger could lead to ruin. It was within this precarious balance, between faith and fear, hope and hunger, that the tragedy of Miriam Angel would unfold. Hers was not a grand story of political upheaval or fame, but one of small domestic sorrow. It began with the simplest of acts, a man's attempt to survive in a city that seemed designed to forget him. That summer, the streets of Whitechapel murmured with discontent, but beneath that noise, in the narrow rooms where the poor slept and worked, something far more intimate was brewing. It was not the sound of protest or celebration. It was the silence of ordinary lives poised unknowingly on the edge of disaster. Outside, the air shimmered with heat. Inside, behind the thin walls of Batty Street, time held its breath. Something, though no one yet knew it, was about to break. The light of early morning in the East End was deceptive. It fell gently on the narrow terraces, gilding the grime and softening the decay. At first glance, it almost seemed beautiful. The shimmer of sunlight on rooftops, the quiet stir of traders setting up their carts. Yet the brightness was a mask, a brief illusion before the day's heat revealed the true texture of the streets. Cracked cobbles, refuse heaps, and walls, sweating with damp. This was the underside of the world's richest empire, the city beneath the glitter. While carriages rolled past marble facades in Kensington and Mayfair, here the air carried the scent of smoke, vinegar, and rot. The same factories that built England's fortune also built its misery, their machines fed by human exhaustion. Children as young as 8 carried baskets through Spitalfields Market before school, and women sewed until their fingers bled. At night, the weary drifted through alleys lit by gas lamps that hissed like serpents, their faint glow swallowed by the fog. The East End was a melting pot of languages and faiths, a world within a world. The Irish lived beside the Polish, the Lithuanians beside the Jews from Warsaw and Odessa. They came because London promised work, because it promised safety, because it was not Russia or Hungary or Galicia. They came believing they could breathe freely. But what awaited them was another kind of suffocation, not of law, but of circumstance. Among these streets, entire families lived in single rooms. The rent was due weekly, and the landlords came without mercy. To fall behind even once meant eviction. Neighbors were both allies and witnesses. Gossip was currency. Kindness was conditional. And yet, amid the poverty, there was resilience, the kind that blooms not from hope, but from habit. It was in this world that Israel Lowe's tried to make his living. He was one of thousands who arrived with skill but without English, who worked silently among the noise of the city. He had once apprenticed as a walking stick maker in Warsaw, learning the patience of craft, how to shape, polish, and balance wood until it felt alive in the hand. But craft meant little in a place ruled by speed and cost. In London, work was measured not by quality but by quantity. To survive meant producing more for less, and to fall behind meant hunger. He had escaped Warsaw to avoid the military draft and the anti-Semitic violence that followed the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. In the chaos that swept through the Russian Empire, Jewish families became easy targets. Windows smashed, synagogues burned, livelihoods erased overnight. Israel left behind parents, siblings, and the faint smell of his father's failed distillery. He carried only a few coins and the stubborn belief that work could save him. He reached Hamburg hidden among sacks of flour and sailed to London aboard a cattle ship, arriving in a city that neither wanted him nor cared. He found a room, then work, first as an assistant in an umbrella factory on Commercial Street, under a man named Mark Katz. Katz was known for fair wages but strict expectations. Israel proved himself quickly. He worked long hours quietly, rarely speaking. He did not drink or wander the streets like other young men. He earned enough to eat, but little more. In the evenings, he would walk back to his lodgings, listening to the sounds that rose from the tenement windows. A baby crying, a couple arguing, a violin playing a half-forgotten tune from home. His life was small but orderly, built on discipline and restraint, perhaps too much restraint. The same quietness that made him a reliable worker also made him invisible. In a world that demanded survival through noise, invisibility was dangerous. It meant no one would notice if he slipped. The room he rented at Batty Street was cramped but sufficient. A bed, a chair, a small table, and a single window that looked out onto the soot-stained wall of the next house. He paid 2 shillings a week to his landlords, Philip and Leah Lipsky, Polish Jews with children of their own. They were kind enough, though weary from years of struggle. They rented every available inch of space to cover their own rent. To share a name with them was coincidence, though it would later become a curse too heavy to bear. The tenants of 16 Batty Street were a small community stitched together by necessity. On the ground floor lived Philip and Leah with their children. In a back room upstairs stayed Leah's mother, an aging woman named Mrs. Rubenstein, who spent her days mending clothes and muttering prayers. In the front room of that same floor lived Isaac and Miriam Angel, newly arrived from Poland. They were young, still learning the city and expecting their first child. Isaac worked as a boot riveter in Spitalfields, earning enough to keep food on the table. Miriam, despite her poverty, kept herself and their room immaculate. In such houses, privacy was an illusion. The stairs creaked under every step. The walls carried sound like paper. The cry of a baby or the clatter of a cup became shared property. The residents knew one another's habits, who rose early, who argued late, who bathed once a week, and who did not. It was a closeness that bred both familiarity and tension. A single misunderstanding could ferment for weeks. And yet, there was comfort in that closeness too, a reminder that no one suffered alone. The East End was full of stories that never reached the newspapers. Stories of women who pawned their wedding rings to buy food, of men who fell asleep standing at workbenches, of children who vanished into the labyrinth of workshops and reappeared only to die of fever. These were quiet tragedies, unnoticed and unrecorded. The death of Miriam Angel would be different only because of what it revealed, not just about one man's crime, but about the machinery of poverty that made such crimes inevitable. As the Jubilee approached, the city's mood turned contradictory. The wealthier districts prepared decorations and fireworks, music filled the parks, and sermons praised 50 years of progress. In the East End, banners hung from churches and synagogues too, though they were faded before the celebrations began. The poor were invited to attend public feasts sponsored by the rich, where a single plate of food was presented as charity. To those who stood in the long queues for meat and bread, it felt less like generosity and more like exhibition. Resentment simmered just below the surface. Riots would soon break out in Trafalgar Square over unemployment and political reform. But in June of 1887, the anger had not yet found its form. It remained diffuse, hidden in the gestures of everyday survival, in the tightening of a jaw, in the lowering of a gaze, in the weary nod exchanged between strangers. It was in this atmosphere that Israel's life began to shift. His work at Katz's factory slowed as the dry weather made umbrellas unnecessary. His earnings dwindled. The rent increased slightly when he began using his room for light manufacturing, but the profit never came. He started borrowing small sums, first from friends, then from his fiancée, Kate Lyons. She believed in him, perhaps more than he believed in himself. She was the sister-in-law of his employer, practical and kind. When she gave him money, she did so with hope, not suspicion. Hope in that part of London was a fragile currency. It could not be pawned, nor eaten, nor worn. It could only sustain a person so long as nothing went wrong. But something was already beginning to go wrong, quietly and invisibly. Each morning, Israel rose early, washed in cold water, and began his work at the bench. The rhythmic scraping of wood against file echoed through the attic. The scent of varnish filled the air. From below came the sounds of the house awakening. Footsteps, voices, the soft cough of an elderly woman. Through the thin walls, he could hear Miriam Angel humming as she prepared breakfast for her husband before he left for work. Life at Batty Street seemed steady, almost peaceful, bound together by the routines of poverty. Yet beneath that quiet, pressures accumulated. Hunger, exhaustion, and pride wove themselves into a silent tension. Outside, the streets of Whitechapel swelled with noise and dust. Inside, a young craftsman bent over his tools, unaware that the walls closing in around him would soon form the boundaries of his own ruin. The air was heavy that day, and the city felt on the edge of something, not yet catastrophe, but the stillness that precedes it. The heat lingered in the city like an illness. By early July, the air inside the narrow houses of Batty Street had become still and heavy, carrying the smells of cooking, sweat, and varnish. Dust rose from every movement and settled again in the same place, as if time itself refused to move. For the working poor, this was not the heat of leisure or summer holidays. It was the heat of suffocation, the slow stifling of hope. Israel Lowe's worked quietly through it all. He was used to endurance. In his small attic room, he spent his days sanding and staining wood, turning rough branches into polished walking sticks. His hands were steady, his movements methodical. The room itself had been converted into a kind of workshop. A small table held the tools he could afford, and a cracked window provided the only light. He would often lean close to the pane, squinting through it at the street below. A brief moment of observation before returning to work. No one in the house could remember ever hearing him raise his voice. He greeted the children politely when he passed them on the stairs. He nodded to Leah Lipsky when she came to collect rent. To the other tenants, he was simply the lodger upstairs, the one who paid on time, made little noise, and kept to himself. If he had private thoughts, they were his alone. It was a common kind of solitude, the sort that came from living between languages and between lives. Like many immigrants, Israel was suspended between what he had left behind and what he could not yet reach. His English was limited, and so his world was limited too. Small, careful, bounded by gesture, more than speech. When he did speak, it was in the slow, deliberate manner of someone choosing each word as if it might cost him. He'd been in England for only 3 years, and already the optimism that had carried him from Warsaw was fading. The work at Mark Katz's umbrella factory had sustained him for a time, but the trade was seasonal. That summer's unbroken dry weather had ruined business. He had taken the risk of working for himself, borrowing money from his fiancée, but orders were scarce. His debts grew heavier. Pride kept him from admitting how close to collapse he was. He was not a man given to complaint, and perhaps that was his undoing. Silence can be a form of dignity, but in times of poverty, it becomes a kind of slow drowning. Each week he borrowed a little more. Each week he promised repayment. Each week he fell a little further behind. His fiancée, Kate Lyons, remained patient. She saw in him something solid and gentle, a man capable of honesty if not prosperity. She had pawned her jewelry to help him, small items, sentimental more than valuable, believing that their sacrifices were shared ones. In the evenings he would visit her and her mother, sitting quietly by the window while they talked. He rarely interrupted, content to listen. To them he seemed thoughtful, perhaps shy. To himself, he was only tired. There was no sign that he harbored violence. Those who later spoke of him remembered his downcast eyes and soft voice. But frustration, when left unspoken, often turns inward until it seeks escape. In men like Israel, poverty worked not as an event, but as erosion. It wore down confidence first, then dignity, then the will to hope. In Batty Street, the rhythms of life continued with small variations. The Angels rose early each morning. Miriam prepared tea for her husband, who worked as a boot riveter in Spitalfields. She would tidy their small room before going out to meet her mother-in-law. To those who knew her, she was gentle, her voice light, her presence quiet. Neighbors said she was always clean, always smiling. She'd been in England less than a year and was 6 months pregnant. Her future, like her husband's, depended on the fragile stability of steady work. It was not an easy existence, but it was theirs. The Angels lived on the first floor, just below Israel's attic workshop. Sometimes she could hear him moving above, the scrape of wood or the clink of metal tools. It was an ordinary sound, one of many in the shared symphony of their house. The crying of children, the hum of conversation, the footsteps up and down the stairwell. There were moments, however, when tension could be felt rather than heard. Poverty compressed life into too small a space, and emotions had no room to breathe. The smallest slight or misunderstanding could linger for days. Leah Lipsky, the landlady, often worried about rent. Her husband's tailoring brought in little, and every tenant's delay was a personal threat to her household's survival. When Israel's payments began to falter, she noticed, he always paid eventually, but the intervals grew longer. He compensated by politeness. When she asked after him, he would bow his head slightly and promise to make things right. She believed him. She wanted to believe him. In that community, trust was not a luxury, it was a necessity. But beneath this fragile order, fear was constant. The fear of debt collectors, of illness, of losing even the smallest foothold in a city that had no patience for weakness. Such fear shaped lives as surely as hunger did. It shaped Israel, too, though he never spoke of it. At night, when the streets grew quiet, he would sometimes leave his small lamp burning long after midnight. The light from his window flickered faintly onto the opposite wall, casting slow, restless movements. Perhaps he was still working. Perhaps he simply could not sleep. Those who live under constant strain often find the night less peaceful than the day. Silence leaves too much room for thought. Outside, the city changed character after dark. The streets of Whitechapel filled with the sounds of pubs and singing, laughter and argument. Somewhere nearby, a violin played in a cafe. The songs of home mixed with the shouts of the streets, a dissonant music that belonged to no one. Israel could hear it through the glass, muffled and distant. It reminded him of the nights in Warsaw when he had imagined a different life. But imagination fades when hunger intrudes. By the middle of June, the strain had become visible. His shoulders were thinner, his eyes shadowed. He still worked, but with the mechanical rhythm of one who no longer believes in the outcome. When asked by his employer about business, he replied that it was slow, but would improve. It did not. The umbrella trade was dying for the season, and his walking sticks sold poorly. It is impossible to say when despair first took hold of him. Despair is not a single moment, but a gradual descent, marked by small compromises. The first is pride. The second is honesty. The last is peace. Israel had begun quietly to lose all three, yet to his neighbors nothing appeared amiss. On the surface he was the same quiet lodger who passed by with his hat in hand. Even his landlords, who saw him daily, noted nothing unusual. Tragedy often hides best in routine. The city itself seemed indifferent, grinding forward through another season of hardship. Crowds pressed through the markets, and carriages rattled down the main roads. Somewhere, in a better part of London, banners for the Jubilee were being hung in preparation for celebration. The Queen's reign had lasted 50 years. For those in Whitechapel, the number meant little. What was half a century to those who measured time in weeks, in wages, in rent? In the attic of 16 Batty Street, a man worked late into the night, surrounded by wood shavings and silence. Below him, a woman slept beside her husband, her hand resting on the child she would soon bring into the world. The building was quiet, the air thick with heat, and nothing yet suggested that one life would end and another would be ruined. But the city, as always, was listening. There are moments in every life when a faint sense of possibility appears, soft as light through fog. For Israel Lowe's, that feeling came in the form of a woman named Kate Lyons. She was steady where he was hesitant, practical where he was unsure. Her voice carried warmth that his own could not, and when she spoke to him, he seemed to stand a little taller, as though borrowing her certainty. Kate was the sister-in-law of his employer, Mark Katz, a man Israel respected but never quite felt at ease with. Through Kate, he glimpsed the ordinary happiness that others took for granted. Conversation, companionship, the simple comfort of being understood. She was not wealthy, but she was kind, and in the measured way of working-class women, she valued reliability over charm. What she saw in Israel was a man who worked hard, who did not drink or gamble, and who, despite his quietness, carried an unspoken decency. For him, she represented a bridge between two worlds, the one he had left behind in Warsaw and the one he still struggled to enter in London. She spoke enough Yiddish to make him feel at home and enough English to help him navigate the city. With her, words came easier. They began to plan a future together, as so many young couples did, counting pennies and dreaming of a small shop that might one day bear his name. It was a fragile dream, but one built on patience rather than passion. Israel spoke little of love, but his gestures revealed it, staying longer after work to walk her home, repairing a broken clasp for her mother, saving what coins he could toward their marriage. For a time, those gestures were enough to hold despair at bay. He moved through his days with quiet purpose, believing that if he could work hard enough, if he could keep his debts contained, stability might finally arrive. But stability is never evenly distributed, and in the East End of London it was often denied to those who needed it most. When his wages at Katz's workshop began to shrink, Israel decided to take a risk. He would strike out on his own, using what little savings he had, and what he could borrow from Kate, to buy his own tools. He converted his attic room at Batty Street into a makeshift workshop. It was both his home and his livelihood, the boundaries between the two, erased by necessity. He bought benches second-hand and rigged up a small vise to hold the canes while he worked. The space was barely large enough to stand upright in, but to him it felt like ownership, however temporary. His landlady, Leah Lipsky, raised the rent from 2 shillings to 5, citing the extra use of the room. He paid it without complaint, though it left him with almost nothing. In late June, he hired 2 assistants from his old workplace, Simon Rosenblum, a fellow Jewish craftsman, and Richard Pittman, a boy of 14 who swept floors and ran errands. Israel promised them fair pay and regular hours. It was, perhaps, an act of faith, an attempt to believe that effort could still yield reward. but the dry weather that summer proved merciless. Umbrellas and walking sticks, once essential accessories, sat unsold. The East End's small trades suffered, and Israel's venture began to collapse almost as soon as it started. His hands were still busy, but his income was gone. By the third week of June, his debts to Kate had grown. She had pawned a hairbrush and a small gold ring to raise 25 shillings for him, a gesture that embarrassed as much as it relieved him. He promised repayment by the end of the week. He said it gently, but the promise carried the weight of desperation. Around this time, those who saw him began to notice a change. He still spoke politely, but there was an unease in his eyes, a watchfulness that hinted at strain. He grew thinner. His movements became mechanical, his silences longer. Inside his small attic, the air smelled of varnish and fatigue. The shavings of wood curled across the floor like fragments of thought, gathering in corners. He worked into the night, the glow from his single candle flickering through the slats of the ceiling. From below, Leah could sometimes hear him pacing, the faint scrape of his shoes against the floorboards. She assumed it was the restlessness of ambition, the mind of a man planning his next steps. She could not have known that those steps led nowhere. For many men in his position, failure did not come as a dramatic collapse. It came quietly, disguised as fatigue. First came the skipped meal, then the missed payment, then the uneasy sense of being watched by circumstance itself. Israel had begun to feel that gaze. Poverty had a way of turning even walls into witnesses. He tried to borrow money elsewhere, but was refused. The walking stick trade required materials he could no longer afford. He began selling unfinished pieces at a loss just to buy food. Each night he rehearsed explanations in his head, what he would tell Kate, how he would repay her. The words sounded convincing in silence, but dissolved when spoken aloud. On the morning of June 27, 1887, Israel left his room and walked the length of Commercial Street to visit her. The day was already warm and the city shimmered under a pale sun. He told Kate he needed another loan, 5 shillings this time, to buy supplies. She looked at him carefully. His face was drawn, his clothes unpressed. Still, she agreed. She sold another small item and handed him the money. He promised, again, to repay her by the weekend. When he left her home, he did not go straight back to work. He wandered for a time along the crowded pavements, his mind circling the same thoughts. The sound of the street, traders shouting, horses clattering, the hum of human life, seemed distant, as if he were walking through a dream. That evening, he returned to Batty Street with the borrowed coins in his pocket. He passed Leah in the hallway, greeted her with a nod, and climbed the stairs to his attic. She thought he seemed tired, though she did not ask why. Everyone in that house was tired. As he sat by the window, the last light of the day slanted across his small workbench, illuminating the fine dust that hung in the air. He stared at his tools, the familiar shapes of his labor. He must have felt the weight of what they represented: skill without security, work without progress, effort without escape. Below him, the angel's room was quiet. Miriam had long since finished her evening chores. Her husband Isaac would be asleep beside her, unaware that above them a man sat awake, watching the light fade. In later years, those who studied the case would wonder what thoughts filled his mind that night, whether he plotted or despaired or simply sat without thinking at all. The record could not say. What is known is that by morning, his fate would begin to move toward the irreversible. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the streets were dark, the Jubilee banners motionless in the hot, still air. Inside, in the silence of the attic, a man who had once been gentle found himself alone with a growing sense that gentleness had no place in the world that had made him. In that narrow room on Batty Street, surrounded by unfinished walking sticks and the scent of varnish, hope finally gave way to something colder, something that would, by the next day, change not only his life, but the life of every soul who lived beneath his roof. And somewhere below, a woman turned in her sleep, unaware that before another dawn arrived, her name would be known across London. Morning came slowly to Batty Street, as it did to most of the East End. There was no sudden burst of daylight through curtains, no brightness spilling across polished floors. The light crept in cautiously through small, grimy windows, soft and muted, the color of smoke. It touched the walls of narrow rooms and fell across faces that were already awake. In the Angel household, it found Miriam, moving quietly, careful not to disturb her sleeping husband. She rose each day before 6. The rhythm of her life was one of quiet purpose, the kind that comes not from choice but from necessity. The room she shared with Isaac, her husband, was modest even by the standards of their neighbors. It held a small bed, a chair, a chest, and a single shelf lined with a few carefully folded garments. The smell of coal dust lingered in the air, mixed with soap and starch. Yet there was a kind of peace in it, a sense of dignity preserved through routine. She tidied their things, swept the floor, and folded the blanket before preparing tea. It was her way of keeping control in a world that offered none. She had learned early that cleanliness was not merely about pride. It was survival. In the crowded tenements of Whitechapel, where disease moved easily from house to house, order was protection. Outside, footsteps sounded on the cobbles as men began their walk to work. Isaac was among them. He worked as a boot riveter in a workshop on George Street. The pay was modest, but he had steady hands and a reputation for punctuality. He left the house quietly, closing the door behind him at 6:15. When he was gone, the silence that remained was almost tangible. The other lodgers still slept, and the air hung heavy with the residue of the previous night, the faint smell of boiled potatoes, oil, and dust. Miriam took her cup of tea to the small window, where she could see the narrow strip of sky that ran between the buildings. She was 6 months pregnant, her body already tired, her steps slower, yet she carried herself with calm determination. Those who knew her spoke of her composure, of how she managed to keep her little world intact despite hardship. Her landlady, Leah Lipsky, said she was always smiling, even when money was short. The neighbors said her room was always neat, her hair always brushed, her voice always kind. These may have been small things, but in such a place they mattered. Her husband adored her. They had come to London less than a year before, leaving behind a village in Poland where work had disappeared and hostility had grown. Like so many others, they had been driven not by ambition, but by the sheer need to survive. They rented the front room of the first floor at 16 Batty Street, directly beneath the attic where Israel Lowe's worked. Their rent was due every Saturday, 5 shillings, sometimes 6, depending on what Leah demanded. They always paid, though not without effort. There were moments of levity, visits from Miriam's mother-in-law, Dina, who lived nearby and brought small gifts of food, or conversations with Mrs. Levy, another lodger who shared Leah's company on errands. The women of Batty Street formed an unspoken alliance, bound by the hardships of domestic life. They helped one another when they could, offering small loans or sharing a meal, though kindness itself carried risk. Debt often eroded friendship. Leah herself was a stern but not unkind woman. She had little time for softness. Her days were spent managing her children, her mother, and her lodgers. She understood poverty too well to romanticize it. She worried constantly about rent, about illness, about what she called bad luck. The men worked. The women endured. Through the thin ceiling above, Miriam could often hear the steady rhythm of Israel's work, the scrape of a blade against wood, the clink of tools. It was an oddly comforting sound, the presence of another life continuing alongside her own. She barely knew him beyond a nod on the stairs. He seemed gentle, if distant. There was no reason to think otherwise. In the evenings, when Isaac returned from work, they shared what food they could afford. Bread, potatoes, perhaps a bit of herring. They spoke quietly in Polish, their voices mingling with the hum of conversation from other rooms. On Sundays, when Isaac did not work, they sometimes walked to Petticoat Lane Market, weaving through the stalls of second-hand clothes and bright fabrics. Miriam liked to touch the cloth even when she could not buy it. For a few minutes, among the noise and color, she could imagine herself part of a different world. But the days between were long. The heat of that June made even breathing feel laborious. Water was scarce, and the shared lavatory in the yard stank under the sun. Leah fetched hot water from a public tap in Back Church Lane, as most in the street did. Miriam often accompanied her, balancing a small tin pail. They walked together, skirts brushing the ground, speaking of nothing in particular. She never complained. Not about the cramped room, not about her husband's long hours, not about the child pressing beneath her ribs. She had grown up with hardship. The life she lived now was not one of luxury, but it was one of safety. Or so she believed. No one could have imagined that this safety would dissolve so suddenly, or that the man upstairs, the quiet lodger with the downcast eyes, would become the last person to see her alive. In the final days of June, something shifted in the atmosphere of the house. It was imperceptible, a tension without form. Leah sensed it first. Perhaps it was the way Israel lingered longer than usual on the stairs, or the way his answers came slower when she spoke to him, or perhaps it was only her imagination, the byproduct of worry and heat. On the morning of June 28, 1887, Leah remembered seeing him in the yard, searching among the scrap for a piece of pipe. He had greeted her politely. Nothing seemed unusual. Later, she recalled that he asked to borrow 5 shillings and that she refused, telling him to ask his fiancée instead. He had smiled faintly, then replied, "I am ashamed to go to her. She gave me money only yesterday." It was a remark she thought little of at the time. That same morning, Isaac left for work as always, closing the door softly behind him. Miriam was still half asleep, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach. She would rise soon, tidy the room, and prepare to meet her mother-in-law for breakfast around 9, but she would never arrive. By mid-morning, the house was quiet. Leah took her children out to the market. Her mother, Mrs. Rubenstein, remained behind to watch over things. In the attic, Israel's 2 assistants arrived for work. The young boy, Richard Pittman, and the older man, Simon Rosenblum, began their usual tasks. For a time, everything seemed ordinary. Then, just before noon, a silence fell, not the usual hush of midday rest, but something heavier, as though the air itself had thickened. In that silence, something terrible took shape behind the locked door of the Angel's room. When Leah returned home around 11, the house was strangely still. Miriam's door was shut. Her mother-in-law, Dina, stood outside, calling her name. There was no reply. Leah climbed the stairs, peered through a small window that overlooked the room, and saw something that made her blood run cold. She could just make out the outline of Miriam lying on her bed, her face turned to the wall, her body motionless. She called for help. Within minutes, the quiet house at 16 Batty Street filled with panic. Voices shouting, feet pounding, hands pushing against the locked door. Outside, the sun blazed, indifferent. Inside, history prepared to open its eyes. In the East End, tragedy was never truly isolated. It belonged to the city itself, woven into its fabric like soot into cloth. The poor were so accustomed to loss that they learned to absorb it quietly, without protest. When a death occurred, a fever, a fire, a fall at the docks, it barely stirred the surface of daily life. People spoke of it briefly, then turned back to work, because the living had to eat. Misfortune was constant enough to seem ordinary. The events of Batty Street would, for a time, pierce that rhythm, but only because they exposed something raw about how the city treated its people. Poverty, like disease, did not shock the rich until it began to smell. The East End was a study in invisibility. The narrow alleys of Spittal Fields and Whitechapel were home to thousands who worked and died unnoticed. They lived behind crooked doors and under leaking roofs, crammed into tenements built for half as many. A family might share a single room, 2, if they were lucky. The walls were thin, and privacy existed only in imagination. A child's cry, a couple's argument, a cough in the night. All became communal property. The poor lived within one another's noise, yet their suffering was often mute. For women like Miriam Angel, invisibility was survival. To be seen too often was to invite pity or danger, both equally unwelcome. She knew her place in the social order, below notice, below consequence. Her beauty was the quiet kind, not striking but serene. And her goodness was practical. She kept clean because dirt drew attention. She smiled because it disarmed cruelty. The world offered her little more than her own resilience, and she wore it like armor. It was this very ordinariness, her modesty, her self-control, that made her death so shocking. In a city where violence was common, this act of cruelty seemed to lack reason. There was no drunken quarrel, no robbery gone wrong, no domestic history of blows or rage. Just a woman, alone in her room, and the sudden intrusion of death. But the truth of such crimes is that they are never entirely sudden. They gestate in silence, in frustration, in hunger, in the slow corrosion of dignity. Every act of violence is preceded by the violence of circumstance. In 1887, the violence of circumstance was everywhere. Even before Miriam's murder, unrest simmered across London. The laboring poor had begun to question the order of things, why they starved while the city glittered with jubilee decorations. Demonstrations were forming, speeches were being given in open squares. The police grew nervous, the government impatient. In the East End, however, the rebellion was quieter. It took the form of desperation rather than protest. Unemployment was spreading, especially among casual workers. Men who lined up each morning outside the docks could wait for hours, only to be turned away. Those lucky enough to find work earned barely enough to survive. When rent day arrived, many were forced to pawn their coats or their boots. When they could not, they simply vanished, their rooms relet to the next desperate soul. In this atmosphere, morality became a fragile structure. Theft, fraud, even violence. They were no longer seen as moral failings, but as symptoms of a system that left no room for gentleness. The line between honest struggle and criminal survival blurred until it disappeared. Israel Lipsky, when, as he now called himself, lived on that line. It was not uncommon for immigrants to adopt new names, either to sound more English or to blend into the growing community. For him, perhaps it was both. The name Lowe's had proved difficult for his employers to pronounce. Lipsky, taken from his landlords, came easily to the English tongue. But names are not always disguises. Sometimes they are mirrors. In taking theirs, he may have wanted to belong, to tether himself to something steady in a world that kept slipping away. Those who later examined the case struggled to reconcile his gentle demeanor with his crime. Yet what they often overlooked was that men like Israel did not fall apart in sudden fits of madness. They broke quietly. Each disappointment carved a small hollow inside them until only despair remained. When the mind has been stripped of hope, reason becomes irrelevant. He had once been a boy who saved drowning children from rivers in Warsaw. Now he was a man drowning in his own life, with no one left to save him. The East End offered little help to those in decline. There were charities, of course, and missions and soup kitchens, but each came with conditions, and each carried humiliation. To accept charity was to admit failure, and pride was often the last possession the poor could claim. So they hid their struggles behind routine, maintaining the appearance of control even as hunger gnawed at the edges. When neighbors spoke of Israel after the murder, they described him as steady and respectable. But in that part of London, such words were less a reflection of truth than of politeness. They meant simply that he had not yet caused trouble. Respectability was fragile currency. It could be revoked overnight. The police, when they came to Batty Street, knew all this. They were familiar with the tenements, the immigrant accents, the smell of shared poverty. They arrived already burdened with assumptions. To them, a crime among the poor was rarely complicated. The motive was always money or lust, and the conclusion was always simple. Someone's desperation had finally boiled over. But this time, something about the scene disturbed even them. A woman dead from acid poisoning, her husband at work, her door locked from the inside. And a man discovered beneath her bed, half conscious, his face scarred by the same liquid that had killed her. It was too deliberate to be chance, too cruel to be impulse. What neither they nor the neighbors could see was that this single act of horror was not born in isolation. It was the natural conclusion of the invisible suffering that defined their world. Poverty created its own logic, a logic in which moral choices collapsed under the weight of survival. As the day of the murder spread through the neighborhood, people gathered in doorways to talk. Some whispered that it was robbery. Others said it was jealousy. A few muttered that it was just another foreigner's business. Prejudice hung in the air as heavily as the summer heat. The newspapers would later exploit that prejudice, portraying the crime not as a tragedy of circumstance, but as proof of the corruption supposedly bred by immigrant life. For the residents of Batty Street, however, the event was personal. It was the violation of their fragile safety. They had lived with hardship for years, but they had believed themselves protected from senseless cruelty. Now, that illusion was gone. In the days that followed, the house filled with policemen, reporters, and strangers. The tenants were questioned, their words twisted into speculation. The neighbors avoided the building as though it were cursed. Those who passed by glanced upward toward the window where the tragedy had occurred, whispering that ghosts lingered there. In truth, what lingered was not haunting, but memory. The kind that burrows into a city's conscience and refuses to leave. The death of one woman, the collapse of one man, became a reflection of the thousands who lived and died in similar shadows. The East End continued as before. The markets reopened, the factories roared, the endless procession of the poor moved forward. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The murder of Miriam Angel had exposed the silent truth of their existence, that the line between victim and perpetrator was thinner than anyone dared admit, and that both were trapped in the same cage of need. The city would not pause to mourn them. It rarely did. Yet in the quiet hours when the gas lamps flickered and the streets emptied, the story lingered like the echo of a heartbeat, a reminder that London's greatness was built not on its triumphs, but on the invisible suffering of those it forgot. In that narrow room beneath the slanting roof of 16 Batty Street, Israel Lipsky tried once more to make something of his own. It began not as ambition, but as refusal to be swallowed by the monotony of endless factory work, refusal to remain one of the faceless many who rose before dawn and returned long after dark. He told himself that skill and patience could still buy independence, that a man with hands as careful as his could wrest a modest living from honest craft. The idea seemed harmless, almost noble. He would buy his own tools, take small orders from the markets, and build walking sticks and umbrella frames for local traders. The attic would serve as both workshop and home. For a few days, perhaps even a week, that dream gave shape to his days. He spoke of it with quiet conviction to his fiancée, Kate Lyons, who listened with the cautious optimism of one used to disappointment. She pawned a ring and a hairbrush to raise the money he needed for wood, glue, and varnish. It was an act of trust disguised as practicality. When the new tools arrived, Israel arranged them neatly on his workbench. The little vise gleamed. For the first time in months, he felt a hint of control. The house itself seemed to acknowledge his effort. Leah Lipsky, the landlady, approved of his industriousness, though she raised the rent from 2 shillings to 5, claiming that business use required higher payment. He accepted without argument. A small increase was worth the dignity of working for himself. At first the days passed in steady rhythm. The scrape of sandpaper, the smell of polish, the rhythmic tap of his mallet formed a kind of music. From the street below came the distant sounds of vendors and horses, the shouts of costermongers and children. It was life in motion, and for a while he moved with it. But prosperity in the East End was always seasonal. The same dry weather that ruined umbrella sales had left walking sticks unwanted too. In prosperous neighborhoods, gentlemen preferred canes carved from exotic woods. In Whitechapel, few could afford even the simplest model. The orders did not come. The finished sticks stood in a neat row against the wall, unbought, slowly gathering dust. Each morning, Israel told himself that tomorrow would bring improvement. He visited traders in Commercial Street, offering samples, lowering his prices, then lowering them again. They nodded politely but declined. Others laughed and said he should wait for rain. He returned to Batty Street each time with less in his pocket and more in his mind. He began to feel watched, not by people, but by failure itself. It hovered above him like the heavy air that pressed down on the rooftops. Pride prevented him from sharing his worries. Even with Kate, he was reserved, speaking only of small successes, never of debt. When she looked at him with her kind, questioning eyes, he turned away, unwilling to let her see the cracks forming beneath his composure. To maintain appearances, he hired 2 assistants, Simon Rosenblum, a fellow craftsman from the factory, and Richard Pittman, a thin, pale boy, barely 14. They were to help with cutting and finishing while Israel handled the delicate shaping. It was a strange decision for a man already short of money, but perhaps he thought the illusion of a small business might bring reality closer. If he behaved as though he were prospering, perhaps he would. The first week went smoothly. They worked in silence, interrupted only by the creak of the floorboards or the distant chatter of the children below. Israel paid them as promised, though doing so emptied his pockets. He smiled as he handed over the coins. Dignity, he thought, was worth the cost. But dignity does not feed a man. By the 3rd week of June, the workshop had grown unbearably hot. The attic trapped the sun's heat, and varnish fumes thickened the air until breathing felt like swallowing smoke. Rosenblum complained of headaches. The boy coughed constantly. Israel told them to take breaks, but he himself worked through the afternoons, driven by a mixture of hope and dread. He could not afford to stop. The sound of his own labor reassured him that he still existed. Each night he descended the stairs to fetch water or a scrap of food. In the kitchen below, he sometimes met Miriam Angel, tidying after supper or washing cups. They exchanged polite nods, nothing more. She was a quiet presence, and perhaps that quietness reminded him of himself. Yet between their rooms lay a gulf wider than any staircase. Her modest domestic world, his collapsing enterprise. Leah Lipsky kept a watchful eye on him. She sensed something brittle beneath his calm. When he borrowed 5 shillings and failed to repay it promptly, she scolded him gently. He smiled, apologized, and promised to make it right. She believed him, because he looked so genuinely ashamed. On Monday, June 27th, he went again to Kate. She could tell at once that the business was failing. His coat was creased, his voice flat. He asked for another loan, just enough to buy supplies, he said. Without hesitation, she sold another small item and gave him 25 shillings. He swore he would repay her by the weekend. She touched his arm as he left, telling him not to worry. He smiled but did not answer. That evening, he returned to Batty Street with the borrowed coins in his pocket. He sat for a long time at the edge of his bed, the money resting in his palm. He must have known that it would not last, that it could neither rescue his business nor restore his pride. Yet he could not bring himself to admit defeat. The next morning, the morning of June 28th, began like all the others. The boy arrived early, followed by Rosenblum. Israel sent them to fetch materials and went out himself soon after. In Backchurch Lane, he entered a small shop that sold oils and acids for industrial use. The shopkeeper later remembered him. A tall, dark man with a foreign accent, polite but nervous. He purchased a penny's worth of nitric acid, explaining that it was for staining walking sticks. The shopkeeper warned him to be careful. The substance was poisonous. He nodded, paid, and left. No one would ever know precisely what he intended at that moment. The acid could indeed have been for work. It was used for polishing metals and etching designs. But poverty distorts purpose. When a man's world begins to collapse, even ordinary decisions acquire darker meanings. He returned home carrying the small bottle. In the hallway, he met Leah Lipsky and asked her for a cup of coffee and a loan of 5 shillings more. She refused, reminding him that she was not a bank. He answered quietly that he was ashamed to ask his fiancée again, for she had given him money only the day before. Leah, impatient, told him to wait until the weekend. Then she went out, leaving her mother, Mrs. Rubenstein, to mind the children. It was around this time, according to testimony later given, that Isaac Schmo, a locksmith and fellow immigrant, knocked at the door seeking work. Israel told him to wait in the attic while he ran an errand. When he failed to return, Schmo grew restless and left. What occurred after remains uncertain, but by late morning the quiet of the house was broken by panic, and Miriam Angel lay dead on her bed, her lips burned, her body still. The penny's worth of acid was gone. To trace the events of that day is to confront the thin line between intention and accident. Perhaps he had meant only to frighten her, perhaps to steal, perhaps something darker. The record cannot say. What is certain is that by noon, the fragile world he had built from borrowed money and borrowed faith had collapsed entirely. Outside, the sun blazed on the narrow street, and the noise of the market carried as usual. Life continued, indifferent. But in the attic of 16 Batty Street, the promise of dignity had turned to dust. The tools lay silent. The varnish thickened in its jar, and the man who had once believed in work as salvation stood on the brink of ruin, though he did not yet know it. The day before the murder dawned with the same dry heat that had lingered over London for weeks. The city seemed to breathe dust. On Batty Street, the sunlight fell flat across the narrow cobbles, dull and lifeless. Curtains were drawn against the glare, but the air inside remained still, thick with the odors of varnish, coal, and unwashed linen. No one in the house at number 16 knew that this would be the last ordinary morning they would ever see. It began as so many others did. The shuffling of feet, the creak of the stair, the muted clatter of cups in the kitchen below. The sounds of life continued without pause, innocent of what was to come. Israel Lipsky awoke before dawn, though there was little reason to. The attic was already hot, and he had barely slept. He lay on the thin mattress, staring at the low ceiling where a faint crack traced the plaster like a map without destination. The faint buzz of flies filled the room. He thought of the coins in his pocket, the ones Kate had given him only a day before. 25 shillings. A small sum that now carried the weight of his survival. He had promised to repay her by Saturday. The words replayed in his mind like a rhythm he could not escape. Saturday. Just 4 days away. He told himself that he would find work, that he would sell something, anything before then. But the thought had begun to lose shape, as if the future itself were dissolving into the heat. Downstairs, he could hear the murmurs of the household waking, the footsteps of Leah moving about the kitchen, the faint cough of her elderly mother, the clatter of a chair being pulled back. The house lived in layers, each room a small world, each tenant an island surrounded by the sound of others. At 7, he rose, washed in the small basin by the window, and began to work. The rhythmic scrape of his tools brought a sense of order, even if the purpose had already gone. For hours he sanded the same piece of wood, though he knew it would never sell. The motions calmed him. They were mechanical, familiar. He needed them. By mid-morning, the heat grew unbearable. The window barely opened, and the air smelled of sweat and glue. He wiped his face on his sleeve and set the stick aside. He was nearly out of supplies, and what remained was of poor quality. He would have to buy more, or close his business altogether. The thought filled him with a dull panic. He descended the stairs quietly and stepped into the yard. The sunlight struck him with full force. The small brick enclosure offered no escape from the glare. He rummaged among a pile of scrap wood and broken furniture, searching for a piece of gas pipe to use as a tool. He found one, dusty and bent, and wiped it clean with the edge of his sleeve. Leah came out soon after, holding a bucket. She greeted him, and he nodded politely, as always. She thought he looked paler than usual, but she said nothing. He asked about her husband and the children, small talk spoken out of habit rather than interest. Then, as if remembering, he asked whether she might lend him 5 shillings. Her reply was sharp, though not cruel. She told him to ask his fiancée. After all, she had given him money only yesterday. He smiled faintly, embarrassed, and said he was ashamed to trouble her again. His tone was soft, deferential, and she believed his sincerity. She told him to wait until the end of the week, and he nodded in resignation. When she went back inside, he lingered for a moment in the yard, the piece of pipe still in his hand. Then he looked toward the street where the air shimmered in the heat and walked away. He stopped at a small shop in Back Church Lane, a narrow street lined with hardware sellers and oil merchants. The shopkeeper, a man accustomed to dealing with tradesmen, barely looked up when Israel entered. He asked for a penny's worth of nitric acid, a common enough purchase for someone in his trade. When the man handed him the small glass bottle, he cautioned him to handle it carefully. "It'll burn through skin if you spill it," he said. Israel nodded and placed the bottle in his pocket. He might have meant to use it for his work. It was not unusual. The acid could stain wood, give it a deeper sheen. But perhaps, as he left the shop, another thought began to form. Faint at first, then clearer, darker. No one could ever know when that thought crossed the boundary from fear to intention. When he returned to Batty Street, the air in the house was still. Leah's mother sat in the front room, dozing. The children's voices drifted faintly from outside. He asked Leah for some coffee, and she agreed, though she had little time. She went out to fetch hot water from the public boiler, leaving her mother in charge. When she returned, she found the attic silent. She called up the stairs, "Come down for your coffee," but received no reply. The boy, Richard Pittman, answered instead, "He ain't here." Leah shrugged and went on with her tasks. It was no concern of hers if he had gone out again. She could not have known that by then the thin thread of Israel's composure had already begun to fray. That afternoon he visited Kate once more. She was surprised to see him again so soon. He looked tired, distracted, as though carrying a weight too heavy for speech. He stayed only a few minutes, promising that everything would be better soon. She believed him because she wanted to. When he left, she watched him from the doorway until he disappeared into the crowd. By the time he returned to his room, evening had settled over the East End. The heat had not lifted, but the light had softened. In the streets below, people gathered in doorways, talking quietly, grateful for the faint breeze that moved through the alleys. Children played until their parents called them in. The city, for all its misery, still found small rituals of survival. Israel sat by the window, staring at the rooftops. He could hear laughter somewhere below, and for a moment he imagined himself part of that simple, anonymous life. One of the crowd, untouched by shame. But the thought was fleeting. The debts, the failure, the endless worry, all returned. He reached into his pocket and took out the small bottle of acid. The liquid caught the last glimmer of daylight, its surface trembling. He set it on the table and watched it for a long time. Outside, the bells of a nearby church marked the hour. He did not move. The air in the room was heavy, the silence thick. Somewhere below, a woman's voice sang softly, perhaps Miriam's, perhaps another tenant's, a low melody that drifted upward and faded into the night. It would be her last song. In the house at 16 Batty Street, life settled into its nightly stillness. Doors closed, lamps dimmed, Footsteps slowed. The city slept, indifferent as always, and in the small attic room, a man sat awake beside a bottle of poison, listening to the faint sounds of breathing from the rooms below, unaware that by the next sunrise, his name would be spoken by every neighbor on the street. Dawn broke over Whitechapel without beauty. The air was dull and thick, the color of tin. From the chimneys rose a sluggish haze that seemed to press back against the light. It was the 28th of June, a Tuesday, and in the houses of Batty Street the day began as it always did, with the weary repetition of survival. In the front room on the first floor, Miriam Angel stirred. The heat of the night still lingered in the walls. She turned on her side and glanced toward the small window where the first light was seeping through the muslin curtain. Her husband, Isaac, was already rising. She heard the faint creak of the floorboards, the sound of him washing in the small basin. He moved quietly, careful not to wake her fully. At 6:15, he buttoned his jacket, kissed her forehead, and slipped out into the morning to begin his walk to George Street. When the door closed behind him, the silence returned. The kind of silence that belongs to the early hours, before the street sellers begin shouting and the wagons start to roll. Miriam lay for a while, half dreaming. She felt the weight of her unborn child pressing against her ribs. Her breathing came slow and steady. Perhaps she thought about breakfast or her meeting with her mother-in-law later that morning. Nothing unusual waited for her in thought or plan. Her day, like so many before it, was ordinary. Above her, in the attic room, Israel Lipsky was already awake. He had slept little, and the sweat on his skin had dried to a thin film. His workshop smelled of varnish and decay. On the table before him sat the bottle of nitric acid, its glass cloudy from handling. He turned it between his fingers as if testing its weight. He might have wondered whether to pour it out, to rid himself of the temptation. But he did not. Downstairs, the rest of the house began to stir. Leah Lipsky, the landlady, was preparing her children for the day. Her husband, Philip, laced his boots, ready to leave for work at the tailor's. He stepped into the small yard, greeted Israel, who was also there searching for a piece of pipe among the scraps, and used the lavatory before departing. Their exchange was polite, uneventful, a few brief words under the already brightening sky. There was no sign of tension, no indication that within hours one of them would be dead and the other damned. Israel carried the pipe upstairs, returning to his small room. Soon after, his two assistants arrived, Simon Rosenblum, dark-haired, serious, and the 14-year-old Richard Pittman, pale and slight. They began their usual work, sawing and sanding, the air quickly filling with dust. The rhythmic scraping of their tools mixed with the distant clatter of carts on Commercial Road. But Israel was restless. He told them they would need another vise for the bench and a sponge for varnishing. He handed Simon a few coins and asked him to fetch them. Then he went out himself, walking again toward Back Church Lane. It was still early, and the streets were quiet. A few shopkeepers were lifting shutters, and a cart of vegetables rattled past, the driver half asleep. Israel's pace was quick, his head slightly bowed. At the oil shop, he stopped to buy another penny's worth of nitric acid. The shopkeeper recognized him from the day before. "Careful with it," the man said again, perhaps half joking, perhaps not. Israel nodded and left. On his way back, he passed a young man, Isaac Schmo, a locksmith who sometimes sought work from fellow tradesmen. Schmo greeted him, asking if there was any labor available. Israel hesitated, then told him to go ahead to his room and wait. Schmo did so, climbing the narrow stairs and finding the attic door unlocked. Inside, the room was small, the heat oppressive. After 15 minutes, when Israel did not return, Schmo grew impatient and left, muttering under his breath. When Israel came back shortly after, he asked Leah for a cup of coffee and again for the loan of 5 shillings. She was busy and refused. "Ask your young woman," she told him. "She's the one with faith in you." He replied quietly, "I'm ashamed to go to her. She gave me money only yesterday." Leah shrugged and went about her chores. She fetched a jug and walked out to Backchurch Lane to buy hot water from the public boiler, the small luxury that saved tenants from lighting fires of their own. As she left, she called to her elderly mother, Mrs. Rubenstein, to keep an eye on the house. While Leah was gone, the room settled into the usual hush of mid-morning. In the attic, the boy and Rosenblum continued working until Israel told them to stop. He said he was going out again and might be gone for a while. They looked at one another, but said nothing. When he did not return, the boy eventually went downstairs to fetch coffee, leaving the tools where they lay. It must have been shortly after this that the silence deepened into something else. At 9 o'clock, Miriam's mother-in-law, Dina Angel, waited for her at their usual meeting place near the market. They always met there on mornings when Isaac worked early, sharing tea and bread before beginning the day's errands. But Miriam did not appear. Dina waited another half hour, then began to worry. At 11, she walked to Batty Street and climbed the familiar steps. She knocked at her daughter-in-law's door. There was no answer. She called her name, softly at first, then louder. Still nothing. She tried the handle, but the door was locked. From another room, Mrs. Rubenstein heard the noise and came to investigate. She tried the door as well, then pressed her ear against it. There was no sound from within, no movement, no voice. Together, the two women called again and again, their anxiety rising. When Leah returned from her errands, she found them still standing there, pale and uncertain. She told them not to panic, that perhaps Miriam had gone out. But Dina shook her head. Her daughter-in-law would never leave without saying a word. Leah remembered that there was a small window on the stairwell that looked into the Angel's room. It was narrow and high, used more for ventilation than light, but it might be enough. She climbed up, steadied herself against the railing, and peered through the gap. A muslin curtain covered part of the view, fluttering slightly in the heat. At first she saw only the corner of the bed. Then her eyes adjusted to the dimness, and she saw Miriam lying motionless, her head turned toward the wall, her dark hair spread across the pillow. Something about the stillness was wrong. Leah felt her stomach twist. She called the others to her side. The women began to push at the door. It resisted at first, then splintered near the lock. When it finally gave way, the smell struck them like a blow, a sharp, acrid stench that burned the throat. The room was small and sweltering. The window was closed, the air heavy. On the bed lay Miriam, her nightdress discolored by yellow stains, her lips and chin blistered. They froze. Then all at once they screamed for help. Neighbors came running. A man named Harris Dway, who kept a stall nearby, was the first to enter. He bent over the bed, his face grim. "She's gone," he said softly. And then, as he turned to leave, he saw something that made him stop. There was movement beneath the bed, a faint shifting of shadow and fabric. He knelt, lifted the sheet, and looked underneath. There, half concealed among the dust and bedclothes, lay Israel Lipsky. His face was pale, his eyes half open. Around his mouth were yellow burns that matched the stains on Miriam's gown. His hands trembled slightly, his breathing shallow. In his pocket, the faint smell of acid still lingered. The room erupted into chaos. Someone ran for the doctor, others for the police. Leah screamed and pressed her hands to her mouth. Dina staggered backward, her grief turning to disbelief. Within minutes, the narrow street outside filled with people. Neighbors, strangers, the curious, the frightened. The sun blazed on their faces as they whispered the name that would soon spread through every alley in the East End. Lipsky. It was not yet a curse, not yet a headline. Only a word of shock, spoken in disbelief. But by nightfall, it would carry a weight that neither guilt nor innocence could ever undo. When the door finally gave way and the women burst inside, the first thing that struck them was the silence. It was not the silence of a sleeping house or a paused breath, but something heavier, final, oppressive. A silence that made the air itself seem dense. The small room, still and sweltering, smelled of acid and sickness. Dust hung motionless in the sunlight that cut through the muslin curtain. For a long moment, no one moved. Leah Lipsky, who had led the charge, stood frozen in the doorway. Behind her, Miriam Angel pressed a hand to her chest. Mrs. Rubenstein, her voice trembling, whispered the dead woman's name as though calling might wake her. But Miriam did not stir. Her dark hair lay tangled across the pillow, her lips blistered, her eyes half open and unfocused. Her nightdress, once white, was streaked with strange yellow stains. Then the shock broke into noise. Leah turned and ran down the stairs, shouting for help. Children began to cry. Doors opened throughout the house. Faces appeared in the hallway. Questions rose and overlapped. What happened? Who's hurt? Is it the baby? No one answered. Outside, a general dealer named Harris Dwee heard the commotion and came running. He was the first man to enter the room. He crossed himself instinctively before leaning over the bed. He touched Miriam's wrist, then her throat. Her skin was still warm, but there was no pulse. The marks around her mouth and chin made him recoil. The smell of acid clung to the sheets, sharp enough to sting his eyes. He pulled the blanket up to cover her and turned to comfort the women. "She's gone," he said softly. "You mustn't touch her now." But as he spoke, something beneath the bed caught his eye. A faint movement, a tremor in the shadows. He crouched down and lifted the hem of the sheet. What he saw there made him stagger backward. A man lay half-hidden among the folds of fabric, his face pale, his lips stained yellow, his hands trembling. His eyes flickered open briefly, then rolled back. It was Israel Lipsky. The acid smell came from him as much as from the bed. For a second, Dwee thought he was dead too. Then the man's chest moved, shallow and irregular. "Dear God," Dwee whispered. He called to the others. The women screamed again, this time louder. Some ran for the street, others clutched at one another in confusion. The noise carried out into Batty Street, drawing a crowd almost immediately. Within minutes, the narrow lane outside was packed with neighbors craning to see what had happened. Dr. K, the local physician whose surgery was nearby, was summoned. He arrived breathless, his assistant in tow, and pushed through the crowd. Inside, the heat struck him like a wall. The doctor's training took over. Emotion could wait. He approached the bed, checked Miriam's pulse, examined the burns, and then turned to the man beneath it. "Pull him out," he ordered. Two constables who had arrived moments earlier obeyed, dragging Lipsky into the open. His body was limp, his head lolling to one side. Dr. K knelt beside him and tried to rouse him. He spoke first in English, then in German, and finally in Yiddish. The man's eyelids fluttered but did not open. When the doctor slapped his cheek lightly, he made a faint sound, half groan, half sigh. Around his mouth, the same yellow marks that stained Miriam's gown were visible, the skin burned and blistered. His breath carried the unmistakable odor of acid. "Alive," the doctor murmured. "Barely." He examined the rest of the room quickly. On the table near the bed, he found a small glass bottle, its cork missing, the inside still wet. "Nitric acid," he said. "Aquafortis, poison." He handed it to a constable and stood. "Take him to the London hospital. He'll need to be watched." The constables lifted the unconscious man and carried him out. The crowd outside erupted into noise again. Some shouted questions, others crossed themselves or muttered curses. The sight of the limp figure, his face discolored, his clothes disheveled, sent a ripple of horror through them. For many, it was the first time they had seen a murderer in the flesh. Inside, Dr. K continued his work. He examined Miriam more thoroughly now, noting the position of her body. One hand on her chest, the other twisted behind her back. The burns around her mouth and throat suggested that acid had been forced into her, not swallowed willingly. There was blood at her temple, and one eye was bruised. She had fought, however briefly. He could not determine whether she had been assaulted in other ways, though the disarray of her clothes suggested a struggle. He looked at her belly, gently pressing his hand against it. 6 months pregnant, perhaps a little more. He exhaled and stepped back. "She's been dead no more than 3 hours," he said quietly. "The body is still warm." Dina Angel collapsed onto a chair, her face buried in her hands. The others stood in silence, the enormity of what had happened only beginning to take shape. When Isaac arrived, called from his workplace by a messenger, the constables tried to stop him from entering. He pushed past them anyway. The sight that met him would follow him for the rest of his life. His wife lay still, her face unrecognizable, her body covered to the shoulders. He fell to his knees beside the bed and called her name. She did not answer. The constables lifted him gently away, their voices low. He was led into the hallway where he sat on the stairs, his head in his hands, whispering in Yiddish. No one understood what he said. By afternoon, the small house had been transformed into a scene of investigation. More police arrived, including a detective from the H Division. Measurements were taken, sketches made, statements recorded. The tenants were questioned separately. Leah described seeing Israel that morning in the yard. She repeated his request for money, his remark about being ashamed to ask his fiancée. She insisted he had seemed calm. He was a good lodger, she said, quiet, always polite. Mrs. Rubenstein told how she had watched over the house while Leah was out, and how nothing had seemed unusual until Miriam's mother arrived. No sounds, no voices, she said. It was as if everyone had gone. The boy, Pittman, testified that he and Rosenblum had worked with Lipsky that morning until he sent them out for supplies. When I came back, the boy said, the door to the room upstairs was locked, so I thought he'd gone out. I went to fetch coffee from Mrs. Lipsky, and she said he wasn't there either. Each account added a fragment, but none provided clarity. The timeline held, but the motive remained invisible. Why would a man who had shown no history of violence, no personal grievance, commit such an act? Why her? By evening, the body had been taken to Dr. K's surgery for examination. Lipsky, still alive, lay under guard at the hospital. He was conscious enough to groan when moved, but refused or was unable to speak. The police listed the evidence: 1 bottle of acid, 1 locked door, 1 dead woman, 1 man found beneath her bed. The simplicity of the facts seemed to demand a single conclusion. Outside, the sun sank over the East End, painting the rooftops with a color too soft for the day it ended. In the street, children played again, and the vendors returned to their work. The tragedy of Batty Street was already becoming a story, repeated, embellished, half-believed. The words murder and Jew began to appear together in whispered tones. In one house, a woman crossed herself before blowing out her candle. In another, a man double-bolted his door. The silence that followed was not peaceful this time. It was the silence of unease, of a city that sensed something darker stirring beneath its surface. And in the ward of the London hospital, Israel Lipsky lay staring at the ceiling, his throat raw, his mouth burned, the smell of acid still faint on his breath. He could hear the footsteps of the guard outside his door, steady and patient. The night stretched long, and for the first time since leaving Warsaw, he wished he had never come to London at all. By the time dusk fell over Whitechapel that evening, the small tragedy of Batty Street had already begun to harden into a public fact. In the language of the police, what had happened there was called a discovery, a word that sounded clinical, almost detached, as if finding a dead woman and the man who might have killed her were acts of mere observation. But to those who had lived through the day, the landlady, the mother-in-law, the tenants who heard the screams, it was something more personal, something that clung to the skin like smoke. At Dr. K's surgery on the corner of Batty Street, the body of Miriam Angel lay under a white sheet. The doctor moved quietly around the table, noting the details that would later fill the coroner's record. Her lips were burned and swollen, the inside of her mouth discolored and raw. The acid had eaten through the tissue of her throat, leaving a pattern of destruction that spoke of deliberate force. Her right temple bore a bruise, as if she had been struck. Her abdomen was distended, the faint curve of pregnancy unmistakable. She had been alive when the acid entered her body. That was certain. The burns were too deep, the spasms too violent to have occurred after death. Kay concluded that the substance had been poured into her mouth while she struggled to resist. The violence of the act was intimate, almost unbearable to imagine. The doctor paused, removed his spectacles, and rubbed his eyes. He had seen the consequences of poverty, disease, and neglect often enough. But this was something different. This was the kind of crime that left an aftertaste in the air, a sour reminder of how thin the line was between despair and cruelty. He signed the preliminary report and folded his hands. "No more than 3 hours dead when I first saw her," he murmured to his assistant, "and expecting a child. It seems the man took the same poison himself, but not enough to finish the job." In the hospital a mile away, Israel Lipsky lay on a narrow bed, watched by a plainclothes constable. His throat burned with pain, and every swallow brought a sting that made his eyes water. He understood only fragments of what was said around him. The nurses spoke English, the officers too quickly for him to follow. He answered in broken words when they tried to question him, shaking his head, claiming not to understand. Yet when one of the doctors addressed him directly about his condition, slowly in simple English, he responded with clear comprehension. The guard noticed this and made note of it. The silence, it seemed, was a choice. For the next 3 days he remained under medical care. His face was drawn, his hands blistered, his lips a strange yellow-white from the acid. He rarely moved, except to turn away from the light. Visitors were not permitted, though the police took turns sitting by the bed, watching for signs of deceit. Meanwhile, the investigation advanced with mechanical certainty. Detective officers from the H Division mapped the rooms of 16 Batty Street, taking measurements and sketches. The broken door was noted, the position of the bed, the curtain, the empty acid bottle. Neighbors were interviewed in turn. The accounts varied, as they always do when fear distorts memory, but one fact remained constant. No one had seen or heard anything until the discovery. The coroner, Wynne Baxter, was informed of the case and set a date for the inquest. He was known for his thoroughness, a man of method rather than sentiment. In later years, he would preside over inquiries that would make his name infamous, the cases of the Whitechapel murders. But in June of 1887, he was simply another official face in the machinery of Victorian justice. On the day following the murder, Baxter arrived at the house to view the scene. The tenants gathered in the hallway as he passed, their faces pale and anxious. He spoke little, taking notes as he moved through each room. In Miriam's, the air still carried the faint sting of acid. The curtains had been drawn, the bedclothes removed. The small traces of a life interrupted were everywhere. A hairbrush, a half-finished piece of embroidery, a pair of worn shoes neatly placed beneath a chair. When Baxter stepped into the yard, he found a small crowd gathered behind the fence. They stared at him with curiosity and suspicion, whispering among themselves. A few crossed themselves as he passed. The East End had always feared the law, not because it loved crime, but because the law was a stranger, a presence that arrived only after damage had been done. Inside the hospital, Lipsky began to recover. The burns on his lips scabbed over. His voice returned in a hoarse whisper. The police took advantage of this. Through an interpreter, they questioned him about the events of that morning. He claimed to remember little. He said that 2 men, his co-worker Simon Rosenblum and a stranger named Isaac Schmo, had attacked him in the hallway, forced acid down his throat, and robbed him. When he awoke, he found himself beneath the bed in the Angel's room. It was a story that strained belief. The detectives exchanged glances. The theory required that 2 men, for no clear reason, had chosen to assault him with the very poison he had purchased the day before. It also required that they somehow carried out this act in a crowded lodging house without being heard, and that they left him alive at the scene of a murder. Still, the officers wrote it down. The truth, whatever it was, would have to survive translation, suspicion, and the heavy machinery of the courts. On June 29th, the coroner's inquest opened at St. George's Vestry Hall. The room was crowded with police, reporters, and local residents. The air buzzed with curiosity. The newspapers had already seized upon the story. The pregnant woman, the foreign lodger, the acid, the locked room. It was the kind of crime that stirred imagination as much as fear. Dr. K gave evidence first, his voice even and clinical. He described the injuries, the cause of death, the likely time of the attack. He stated firmly that Miriam Angel had not taken the acid herself. This was no accident, he said. The poison was administered by another's hand. Next came the witnesses from the house. Leah, her husband, Mrs. Rubenstein, Mrs. Levy, and the boy Pittman. Each spoke of what they had seen, what they had heard, or more precisely, what they had not heard. The absence of sound became its own kind of testimony. Then came the landlord's statement, confirming that the man known as Lipsky had lived in the attic for several months and was considered well-behaved, if somewhat withdrawn. He had been in debt, but not violent. When the coroner read out the evidence of the bottle, the burns, and the acid's purchase, a murmur passed through the crowd. The logic was undeniable. The poison had been bought by him, the bottle found beside him, the woman dead by its use. The conclusion was as neat as it was terrible. Baxter concluded the session with the formal finding: willful murder by nitric acid, the unlawful act of one Israel Lipsky. The man himself, still weak, did not attend, but by the following week he was deemed fit to stand. He was transferred from the hospital to Newgate Prison, where he would await trial. The newspapers gave him no mercy. They printed his name in bold, describing him as a dark, melancholy foreigner of unwholesome appearance. Some suggested robbery as the motive, others hinted at lust. Theories multiplied like flies around the corpse of the truth. For the people of Whitechapel, the case became more than a crime. It was a mirror held up to their fears, the poverty, the strangers in their midst, the violence that seemed to rise naturally from despair. In the evenings, men argued in public houses about guilt and innocence, while women clutched their children a little closer as they passed the house on Batty Street. Inside his cell at Newgate, Lipsky sat in the half-light, the smell of stone and iron around him. He tried to pray but found no words that would hold. Each sound from the corridor, the turning of a key, the shuffle of boots, reminded him that he was no longer free. Outside, the city continued, indifferent as ever. The smoke of the factories drifted over Whitechapel, and the poor went to work. The name Lipsky began to spread beyond the neighborhood, whispered in markets and printed in headlines. It no longer belonged to a man. It had become a story, and stories, once loosed upon the city, are impossible to silence. The coroner's verdict spread through Whitechapel like the sound of distant thunder, slow at first, then rolling through every street and lodging house until even those who had never seen 16 Batty Street spoke of it as though they had been there. The newspapers, hungry for sensation, wrote of the acid murder in bold letters. They described Miriam Angel as the innocent victim of a foreign monster, and Israel Lipsky as a demon in human shape. It was the kind of story that confirmed everything London wanted to believe about its poorest quarter, that it was dark, alien, dangerous, and beyond redemption. The truth was quieter. The house stood still in its shame. The tenants continued their lives because they had to. Work did not wait for grief. Leah scrubbed the floors with vinegar until the smell of acid faded. Her mother, trembling, whispered prayers over the walls. The children grew silent whenever footsteps passed on the stairs. Isaac Angel, who had lost both wife and child in a single hour, moved out within days, leaving behind only a broken chair and a torn piece of curtain. Outside, the Jubilee banners still hung from the richer parts of the city, tattered by summer wind, but bright enough to hide the poverty beneath. The Queen's golden year had not ended. For some, it never began. In Newgate Prison, Israel Lipsky sat behind a heavy door with a small square opening through which the guards observed him. The burns around his mouth had begun to heal, leaving pale scars. He could eat again, though slowly. The first days passed in a haze of exhaustion, his mind heavy and dull from shock. The chaplain visited him, speaking gently about repentance. Lipsky nodded but said little. He still insisted that he had not murdered anyone. The police had already taken his formal statement. He repeated the story he had told in the hospital, that he had been attacked by two men, Rosenblum, his assistant, and a stranger named Schmo, who forced acid down his throat and left him beneath the bed. He claimed that he had gone to the Angel's room only because they had money and that the men had wanted to rob them. The detectives listened, but disbelief crept over their faces as he spoke. The narrative was too confused, the logic too thin. Why had these supposed assailants spared him? Why had they chosen that house, that victim? There were no answers, only repetition. He told the same story again and again, as if clinging to it might somehow make it true. In the public mind, his guilt was already certain. The newspapers printed illustrations of the house, showing the narrow stairwell, the window, the bed. Artists imagined the scene, the moment of the attack, the victim's terror, the killer's cruelty. These pictures bore little resemblance to reality, but accuracy mattered less than outrage. In the taverns of the East End, men shook their heads and spoke of the Jew murderer. The word Lipsky began to slip from noun to insult, hurled in arguments, shouted from passing carts. In a neighborhood already tight with prejudice, it took on a life of its own. Inside the prison, Israel grew thinner. His days were measured by meals, prayers, and interrogations. Sometimes he asked for writing paper. Sometimes he simply stared at the wall. The warders found him quiet, obedient, and melancholy. One of them remarked that he seemed more broken than wicked. Another said he was certain the man would go to the gallows without protest. When the trial opened at the Old Bailey on July 25th, the courtroom filled quickly. The air was thick with heat and the smell of sweat and ink. Reporters crowded the benches, scribbling notes. The public gallery overflowed. People came not to seek truth, but to witness the theater of judgment. The prosecution's case was simple and devastating. They called Dr. K, who described in precise detail the burns, the acid, and the position of the body. They called Harris Dewey, who recounted finding Lipsky beneath the bed. They called Leah, who repeated her conversation with the accused that morning. The request for money, the admission that his fiancée had just helped him. Each testimony fit neatly into the pattern the Crown had drawn. A man desperate for funds, a woman who had recently borrowed rent money, and an opportunity that ended in violence. When the prosecution produced the acid bottle, found near the bed and traced to the same shop where Lipsky had purchased his supply, the courtroom stirred. The connection was undeniable. The defense, led by Gerald Gagan and John McIntyre, tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that no one had seen the act itself, that the defendant's strange behavior might have been the confusion of a man who had tried and failed to take his own life. But their arguments lacked force. Gagan's voice shook. His hands trembled as he read from his notes. There were whispers that he had been drinking before the session. Lipsky sat in the dock, pale and motionless. He understood only fragments of the English spoken around him. When the interpreter translated, he nodded occasionally, his face unreadable. The jury watched him with a mixture of fascination and unease. There was something about his stillness that disturbed them more than any outburst could have done. It was not defiance, nor was it remorse. It was vacancy. By the end of the 5th day, the trial had become a formality. The evidence spoke louder than the man. When the judge, Justice Stephen, addressed the jury, he offered them two possible motives: lust or greed. Either, he said, could lead a man to such a deed. The choice of poison, he added, suggested deliberation rather than rage. The jury retired for deliberation. It took them 8 minutes. When they returned, the foreman's voice was calm. "Guilty," he said. The judge placed his spectacles on the desk, then looked at the accused. You will be taken from hence to the place from which you came, and thence to a place of execution, there to be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul." Lipski listened without visible reaction. He merely bowed his head. "I innocent," he murmured through the interpreter. "I did not do this." The gavel struck. The noise of the court swelled, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of voices, the distant click of pens recording another verdict for the archives of crime. That night, back in his cell, Israel sat for hours without moving. A candle burned low beside him. He thought of Kate, of her kindness, of the coins she had given him. He thought of his parents in Warsaw who would learn from the papers that their son had become a murderer in a foreign land. He tried to remember the sound of the river where he had once pulled a drowning child to safety. The memory felt like a story told to someone else. The chaplain came again, urging him to confess. "The time is short," he said gently. "Better to meet God with truth than with silence." But Israel only shook his head. He could not, or would not, speak. Whether from shame, confusion, or despair, no one could tell. Outside the prison walls, the city carried on. The Jubilee celebrations were over, replaced by riots and unrest. The poor marched in Trafalgar Square demanding work, and the police answered with batons. The newspapers that had condemned Lipski now printed the names of other victims, other injustices. The East End swallowed its tragedies whole, digesting them into rumor and memory. Yet for all the noise of London, a quiet current of doubt began to move. Some whispered that the trial had been too quick, the defense too weak, the language barrier too great. Others said the evidence had been contaminated, the bottle moved, the witnesses confused. But these whispers were lost in the louder call for punishment. In August, when the final appeal was denied, the date of execution was set. On the eve of his death, Israel wrote a letter to his fiancée, apologizing for the sorrow he had caused her. He thanked her for her faith and asked her to forgive him. To his parents, he sent no message. Perhaps he believed the silence would spare them. That night, as he waited in the dim cell, the city outside turned restless again. Somewhere beyond the prison walls, a child cried, a carriage passed, a church bell rang the hour. The world remained untroubled by one man's ruin. And when the guards checked on him before dawn, they found him sitting upright, his eyes open, his lips moving in a whisper no one could hear. Whether it was prayer or memory, no one could say. In the days that followed his conviction, the world around Israel Lipski seemed to contract. The corridor of Newgate Prison was long and echoing, yet his own cell felt smaller with every sunrise. The walls sweated in the late summer heat. His meals came on a tin plate, silent and without ceremony. The guards had grown accustomed to him. He was not troublesome, not loud. He moved with the mechanical obedience of a man already halfway removed from life. Each morning the chaplain came, bringing words that no longer reached him. Each night the warders checked the locks, speaking to one another in low tones about the case that had turned from news into routine. Outside, however, the story refused to die. The newspapers had grown divided. Some, still certain of his guilt, called for swift execution. Others, disturbed by the speed of the trial and the uncertainty of translation, began to question the justice of condemning a man who barely understood the words spoken against him. Letters arrived at the Home Office from clergy, politicians, and ordinary citizens pleading for a reprieve. 500 people signed their names to petitions. The Daily News published editorials warning against haste. The Times, more cautious, urged prudence but firmness. To the public, Lipski had become less a man than a symbol, a test of mercy in an unforgiving age. For some, he represented the dangerous foreigner, the embodiment of urban decay. For others, he stood as proof that the machinery of justice could grind too swiftly, too surely for truth to escape. In his cell, Lipski remained strangely calm. When his solicitor visited, bringing word of the petitions, he seemed unmoved. "I thank them," he said through the interpreter. but they do not know." "What do they not know?" the solicitor asked gently. Lipsky looked down at his burned hands, the skin still discolored. "The story," he said, "the real one." And so, haltingly, he began to tell a new version of events, one that would later appear in police reports and newspapers, baffling even those who wished to believe him innocent. He said that on the morning of the murder, he had asked his employee, Rosenblum, to fetch him some brandy. Rosenblum left, returning some time later with the locksmith Schmo. The two men, according to Lipsky, then attacked him on the landing, forcing him to the floor, prying open his mouth, and pouring acid down his throat. As he struggled, he heard one of them say, "That is the brandy you asked for." Then they demanded money. He told them he had only a sovereign and had given it to buy the brandy. One of the men laughed. "If you do not give us more," he said, "you will be as dead as the woman." Lipsky claimed he had heard them speaking about a woman, but he did not know who they meant. He said he lost consciousness soon after and knew nothing until he awoke under the bed, his throat burning, the room filled with smoke and silence. The solicitor listened without interruption. The story was elaborate, inconsistent, and yet delivered with a kind of weary conviction that made it difficult to dismiss outright. "Why did you not tell this to the court?" he asked. "I was afraid," Lipsky replied. "They would not believe me. And now? I am still afraid," he said softly, "but I am already dead." The solicitor wrote down every word. He would later repeat them before the Home Secretary in a final appeal for clemency, arguing that the man's confused state, the poor translation, and the possibility of other culprits warranted at least a delay. But the machinery of justice was already in motion. Mercy, once denied, seldom found its way back. Within the Jewish community of London, the case had begun to cause division. Some believed Lipsky guilty and feared that defending him would only worsen the prejudice already directed toward their people. Others, convinced that he was a victim of bias, organized vigils and public appeals. They pointed to the speed of the trial, the incompetence of his defense, and the widespread hostility toward immigrants as evidence that fairness had never been possible. Rabbi Gordon, a quiet man of intellect and compassion, visited Lipsky in prison. He found him subdued but coherent. They spoke in Yiddish for nearly an hour, the rabbi asking about his family, his work, and his soul. Lipsky wept when he mentioned his mother. When asked again whether he had committed the murder, he denied it with a quiet certainty that left the rabbi uneasy. That night, Rabbi Gordon began his own small investigation. He spoke to the witnesses, the landlord, and even to Harris Dewey, the man who had discovered the body. What he found only deepened the confusion. Harris confessed that in the chaos of the discovery, he had moved the bottle of acid himself. He had found it on the table, he said, and fearing that Isaac Angel, the widower, might be accused, he slipped it into his pocket. When Lipsky was later found under the bed, he placed the bottle there, thinking it belonged to him. The confession was clumsy, perhaps self-serving, but it raised a disturbing question. If the bottle had been moved, what else in the scene might have been disturbed before the police arrived? The rabbi brought his findings to the authorities, but they made little impression. The Crown's case was complete, the sentence already scheduled. A new narrative, however plausible, was not enough to reopen a verdict. On August 20th, only 2 days before the execution, the Home Office rejected the final appeal. The newspapers printed the decision in bold type. No reprieve for Lipsky. Crowds began to gather outside the prison gates. For many, executions remained a grim spectacle, even though the hangings were now conducted in private. The raising of the black flag at Newgate still drew hundreds who wished to be near the moment of death. In his final hours, Israel wrote 2 letters, one to his fiancée, Kate Lyons, and one to her mother. His handwriting was uneven, the words simple. Apologies, gratitude, and a request that they sell his few possessions to settle his debts. "I thank you for your kindness," he wrote. "May God forgive me for the wrong I have done." To the chaplain and the governor of the prison, he made a final statement. He confessed, they said, to the murder of Miriam Angel, admitting that his motive had been robbery and that he had acted alone. The words were taken down, signed, and witnessed. When the news reached his solicitor, he refused to believe it. He was broken, he said. He would have said anything by then. At dawn on August 22nd, the execution took place. The hangman, James Barry, had calculated the drop, but misjudged the rope's length. When the trap opened, the fall was too short. Lipsky did not die instantly. The witnesses later described a long, terrible silence, punctuated by the sound of struggling. It took 10 minutes before he was declared dead. Outside, the black flag was raised above Newgate's walls, and the crowd cheered, a coarse, instinctive sound that echoed down the street. For a few moments, his name was only a noise on the wind. The newspapers printed the final scene with satisfaction. Some called it justice, others an embarrassment to civilized society. The Jewish Chronicle published a quiet editorial, mourning not only the victim, but also the failure of charity in a world too quick to judge. In Whitechapel, the house on Batty Street fell back into silence. New tenants arrived within months, drawn by low rent and indifference to history. The neighbors avoided the subject. The stains on the floorboards were scrubbed clean, but the memory remained, lingering like a shadow in the corners. The word Lipsky continued to circulate through London's streets. It became an insult hurled at Jewish men in markets and alleys, shouted during fights, whispered in contempt. It would echo again a year later, when a witness to another murder, this time one attributed to the unknown killer the world would call Jack the Ripper, heard that same word shouted in the dark. And so the story that began with one act of desperation grew into a symbol of something larger, a collision of fear, prejudice, and poverty that no verdict could resolve. Whether he had been murderer or scapegoat no longer mattered. What remained was the silence that followed his name, the uneasy recognition that the line between guilt and survival was never clear in a city where justice itself was too easily poisoned. When the black flag rose over Newgate Prison on the morning of August 22, 1887, London paused, not out of sorrow nor even pity, but with the muted curiosity that attends all human punishment. For a brief moment before the ordinary noise of the city resumed, there was the faint awareness of something irreversible having occurred. A life had ended, and the law, satisfied with itself, drew a line under the name Israel Lipsky. Within hours, the newspapers carried the news. Some devoted only a column, others filled entire pages. The Morning Advertiser called it a necessary deterrent to the criminal classes. The Daily Telegraph noted that the foreign element of the East End has received a lesson in the swift hand of British justice. A few dissenting voices, quieter, wondered whether the lesson taught anything at all, or whether it merely revealed how easily fear could masquerade as certainty. By midday, the crowds had dispersed from Newgate Street. The hawkers folded away their pamphlets. The street musicians struck up familiar tunes. Life resumed. In the East End, where the murder had been born, the case had already become folklore. Mothers warned their children not to linger in alleys after dark, lest they meet a Lipsky. The name was no longer that of a man, but of a warning, a whisper that slid through the cracks of tenement walls, more powerful for its vagueness. Inside the small communities of Jewish immigrants who had once known him, the response was uneasy. There was relief that the affair was over, but also shame, a quiet, unspoken shame that clung to synagogue steps and market stalls. Some refused to mention the case at all. Others insisted that he had been framed, that no Jew would commit such a barbarous act. The arguments went nowhere. In the weeks that followed, Rabbi Gordon found himself unable to sleep. He replayed his conversations with Lipsky, his calm denial, his strange mixture of humility and despair. The rabbi had believed him partly guilty, partly lost, a man trapped not by evil but by circumstance. After the execution, he wrote in his journal that truth is often buried with the condemned. He visited Batty Street once more that autumn, walking slowly along the narrow lane where the house still stood. The neighborhood looked the same as it had before the murder. The same cracked windows, the same smell of refuse and smoke. Yet there was an unease to the silence. Poverty, like grief, erases its causes but not its traces. The new tenants had already moved in. The landlord, practical and untroubled, had lowered the rent and found another family within a week. The walls had been repainted, the floorboards scrubbed, the memory domesticated into routine. Only Leah remained. She greeted the rabbi politely but refused to speak of that morning. Her husband had grown withdrawn. Her children no longer played in the yard. The house seemed to exist in a kind of suspended repentance, neither cleansed nor cursed, simply resigned. For the city, the case's conclusion marked a momentary satisfaction. Justice had been done, and the machinery had worked. But beneath the surface, the unease lingered. The speed of the trial, the confession that arrived only on the eve of execution, the stories of the bottle being moved. These details refused to settle neatly. They returned in small circles of conversation. The police station, the vestry, the press room, the pub. Doubt, once released, has a life longer than guilt. It was in these circles that another voice began to emerge, that of James Barry, the hangman. Barry was a professional in the most clinical sense, a man who measured rope lengths with mathematical precision and considered his work a grim science. But Lipsky's death had disturbed him. The drop had been misjudged, too short. What should have been instant had turned into minutes of strangulation. The condemned man's body twisting and trembling as the crowd outside waited for the black flag. Barry later wrote that it was one of the executions that changed him. He began, slowly, to question the morality of the trade that had sustained him. Years later, he would campaign publicly for the abolition of the death penalty. If there is such a thing as legacy, perhaps that was Lipsky's, the conversion of his executioner. Meanwhile, the story continued to shift shape. In pamphlets and serialized accounts, he was alternately described as a calculating murderer, a victim of anti-Semitic bias, or a tragic soul crushed by poverty. The city, as it often did, turned tragedy into entertainment. Street singers performed verses about the Jew of Batty Street. Penny illustrators sold grotesque portraits of his face, exaggerating the darkness of his eyes, the curve of his mouth. To the respectable classes, these images served both as warning and reassurance, proof that crime had a face and that the gallows would always prevail. Yet even in the official records, contradictions remained. The exact position of the door, the presence of a second acid bottle, the timeline of the witnesses, all left open questions that no inquiry would answer. Justice Stephen, who had presided over the trial, recorded his own doubts years later, noting only that the case was clear in law, if not in conscience. For the families left behind, there was no such clarity. Isaac Angel, widowed and childless, moved to another part of London. His anger turned inward. 2 months after the execution, he returned to Batty Street accompanied by his brothers. He smashed the front windows and struck Leah in a rage, shouting that she had defended a murderer, that she and her husband had brought ruin upon his wife. He was arrested but released with a caution. The newspapers barely mentioned it. It was as if the story had exhausted their sympathy. In the slums, sympathy was a luxury. The poor could not afford moral curiosity. What mattered was rent, food, survival. For them, the tragedy of Miriam Angel and the execution of Israel Lipsky were not moral puzzles but reminders of proximity, that the line between victim and culprit was measured in inches, in hunger, in luck. The city, indifferent yet watchful, absorbed them both into its endless catalog of human ruin. Within a year, new crimes would capture its attention. In the same quarter of London, women would begin to die again, brutally, systematically, at the hands of another faceless killer. And when witnesses heard the word Lipsky shouted in a dark alley near Berner Street, some would swear that it was the murderer himself, using it as a slur. Others believed it was directed at a passerby. The word had outlived the man. It had become shorthand for guilt, for the otherness of those who lived in the East End's shadow. History, careless in its repetitions, rarely distinguishes between coincidence and omen. In later years, those who studied the case, journalists, criminologists, moralists, treated it as a precursor, a rehearsal for the terrors that would follow. It had all the ingredients: poverty, prejudice, mystery, and a city eager to assign blame. But stripped of its notoriety, the story remains painfully simple. A young woman died in her bed, her unborn child with her. A man, desperate and ashamed, lost himself in the small distance between need and cruelty. The machinery of law moved quickly, perhaps too quickly, and another life was taken to balance the scales. The sum of it all was silence. No revelation, no moral clarity, only the uneasy knowledge that mercy, once refused, leaves a residue as persistent as guilt. The rabbi, years later, would write in his notebook, "To forgive without certainty is the hardest work of the soul, yet we must try, for certainty is the luxury of the living." In the long memory of London, the name of Lipsky would fade to an echo, a fragment embedded in the darker chapters of its history. But for those who lived through that summer of 1887, the neighbors, the witnesses, the grieving husband, the executioner, the sound of that name lingered like the faint smell of acid in the air long after the door to Batty Street had closed for the last time. Time in London does not heal, it accumulates. It gathers in layers, in soot and silence, in the slow shifting of bricks that have absorbed too much sound. The little house at 16 Batty Street remained standing long after the names of those who lived there had faded from conversation. People moved in, people moved out, and the street, like the rest of Whitechapel, adapted to the forgetting. But forgetting in such a place is never clean. It is merely the settling of dust over what still breathes beneath. By the spring of 1888, the house had new tenants. The walls had been repainted, the carpets replaced, the doors repaired. The landlord, eager to erase any connection to the scandal, rented the attic to a cobbler and his wife. They paid promptly and spoke little. When asked, they said they had heard something about a tragedy, but did not believe in ghosts. The rent was cheap, and that was enough. Yet for those who had been there, who had lived through that summer of 1887, the house remained uneasy ground. Leah Lipsky, the former landlady, had never quite recovered from the notoriety. The name she shared with the condemned man had stained her life in ways she could not have foreseen. Strangers whispered in the market when she passed. Children mocked her surname. She had no kinship with Israel, yet the city had bound them together as if misfortune were hereditary. Her husband, Philip, had grown bitter. His work as a tailor dwindled, and he began to drink, unable to shake the conviction that fate had singled them out. Sometimes, Leah dreamed of the sound. That first scream, the rush of feet on the stairs, the smell of the acid. She would wake before dawn, the image of Miriam on the bed still vivid, the yellow stains refusing to fade. Even when she prayed, her mind returned to that room, to the sight of the lifeless woman and the quiet figure hiding beneath her bed. In those moments, she wondered whether sin could pass through walls like smoke, clinging to those who only witnessed it. The new residents, of course, knew nothing of such memories. They filled the house with new noise, the rhythm of a cobbler's hammer, the crying of a baby, the murmur of evening talk. Yet the house itself, if such a thing could be said, seemed to remember. The floorboards creaked more than they should have. The air, even on bright days, carried a faint, damp chill. There were nights when the cobbler's wife swore she heard footsteps in the room above, though there was no room above the attic. When she told her husband, he only shrugged. "It's an old house," he said. "Old houses talk." They were not the only ones to hear it. The neighbors still avoided the side of the street after sunset. Children hurried past, whispering about the woman who had been poisoned. The older residents of Whitechapel, hardened to death and misfortune, still crossed themselves when they walked by. The city's poor have long memories for cruelty, especially when it happens among their own. That winter, when the first of the Whitechapel murders began, the name Lipsky rose again, not in the courtroom, but in the mouth of a witness. On a dark September night, a man named Israel Schwartz saw another man attack a woman in Berner Street, barely 200 yards from Batty Street itself. The attacker, hearing the commotion, turned and shouted, "Lipsky!" towards someone unseen before fleeing into the dark. The word carried through the investigation like a spark in dry straw. It appeared in newspaper headlines, in speculation, in gossip. Was it a curse, a slur, a name? No one could say. But those who had lived on Batty Street knew it at once. It was their past, resurrected in another killing. And for a moment, the old fear returned. The idea that something malignant had taken root in that corner of the East End, something that fed on poverty and shame. To the police, the connection was coincidence. To the people, it was proof that the city itself remembered. The same words, spoken in two murders a year apart, seemed to suggest a chain of meaning, even if no one could articulate what that meaning was. The historian's mind seeks causes. The sufferer's mind seeks patterns. And in the East End, where suffering was as constant as hunger, patterns were easier to believe in than justice. The house at number 16 became, in time, simply another address. The landlords changed. The street was renamed. The records faded. But those who walked its pavement decades later found it hard not to look up at the narrow window of the first-floor room, wondering which pane had once caught the reflection of the doctor's lantern. Which floorboard had borne the weight of a body falling. When journalists returned to Batty Street years later, writing retrospectives on the Lipsky case, they described the house as unaltered. The staircase still narrow, the landing still steep, the same window in the stairwell from which Leah had first glimpsed the motionless figure on the bed. The building seemed preserved not by care, but by neglect, as though decay itself had become a kind of monument. One reporter noted that the smell of damp hung thick in the air and that the tenants avoided discussing what had happened there. When pressed, an elderly woman who lived nearby muttered, "That's the house where the devil slept under the bed." Then she closed the door. But for those who knew the story, those who had read the inquest, studied the evidence, traced the blurred lines between guilt and accident, the house stood as something subtler. It was not cursed. It was complicit. It had witnessed both the suffering of a woman and the despair of a man, and it had remained indifferent to both. The same walls that had enclosed the crime continued to hold warmth and laughter, tears and sleep, as if nothing had changed. Perhaps that was the true horror, that the world and the places within it simply continued. Dr. K, now older, still kept his notes from the inquest. Sometimes he reread them, tracing the clinical phrases, death by nitric acid, burns consistent with ingestion, time since death, 3 hours. They were the words of science, detached, necessary. Yet as he aged, he found himself troubled by what those words concealed. He began to see in every victim's report a story untold, every line of ink a small failure of mercy. He would die in 1894, the same year that London's press still printed theories about Jack the Ripper. In his final diary entry, he wrote, "The poor die loudly, but they are buried quietly." The world that had condemned Israel Lipsky moved on, reshaping itself into another century. The East End grew denser, filthier, then slowly emptied again as the city expanded outward. Factories rose, then fell. The very street where Miriam had lived was renamed Henriquez Street. as if language itself might conceal the past. The old tenement was demolished, rebuilt, sold, and forgotten. Yet in every retelling, the story returned, a quiet reminder of how little distance there is between dignity and ruin. And still, for those who walk through the East End on certain evenings when the air is heavy and the streetlights flicker in the fog, there remains the feeling that the city itself is watching, that its narrow houses, its worn pavements, and its darkened corners remember what the living have chosen to forget. Because some walls, it seems, do not let go. They watch and they wait, indifferent but awake, witnesses to the small, recurring tragedies of a city that never truly sleeps. For a while after the hanging, London could not decide what to do with the memory of Israel Lipski. It was too recent to be forgotten, yet too awkward to be spoken of directly. The law had done its work, and the newspapers had already moved on to new sensations. Another scandal, another riot, another body found in a darkened lane. Only the silence remained, an uncomfortable pause in which neither triumph nor pity could quite take shape. The official files of the Home Office recorded the case in brief, bureaucratic language. Execution carried out. No irregularities observed. The phrase was both false and true. No irregularities, perhaps, in the paperwork, but every detail of the event had been irregular in spirit. The too short rope, the desperate petitions, the confused confession. In the language of government, these things had no category. The state had pronounced, and so the matter was considered complete. In the courts and law schools, however, the story persisted in quieter ways. The trial was studied as an example of circumstantial conviction, cited in lectures on the reliability of witness testimony and the dangers of hasty judgment. Students read the transcript and debated the motives: robbery, lust, despair. None could quite decide. They spoke of it as an abstract problem, a specimen preserved for instruction. The woman and the man had become concepts, victim and culprit, their humanity stripped away by the distance of scholarship. Yet outside the walls of academia, the case had left marks less visible, but more enduring. In the East End, the word Lipski lingered as a slur, a shorthand for foreignness and guilt. It was muttered by policemen when they arrested Jewish immigrants, hissed by street boys when they jeered at market traders. To be called by that name was to be reminded that belonging was conditional, that one's presence could at any moment be recast as threat. A single crime, or what was believed to be one, had reinforced centuries of suspicion. Among the Jewish community, a more private reckoning took place. In sermons and meetings, rabbis spoke of the duty to live honorably in the eyes of the host nation. Some cautioned against defiance, others urged unity in the face of hostility. They disagreed on whether Lipski's guilt was real, but they agreed that his story had revealed the fragility of their standing. Even the most pious and industrious could find themselves condemned, not for what they had done, but for what they represented. In this way, the case did what the acid itself had done. It burned, invisibly but deeply, leaving scars that would not heal. Meanwhile, in Whitechapel, poverty continued its slow erosion. The same narrow streets, the same overcrowded tenements, the same ceaseless noise of survival. The police patrols increased after the murders of 1888, but their presence brought little comfort. The residents learned that protection and suspicion often wore the same uniform. When the Rippers' killings began, the public once again turned its gaze toward the East End, searching for monsters among the poor. Reporters described the district in language almost identical to that used a year earlier in the coverage of the Lipski case: a labyrinth of vice, a nest of aliens. The pattern had simply repeated itself. In the law reports of the 1890s, the case appeared only occasionally, usually as a footnote. Judges cited it when discussing confessions obtained too late, or the admissibility of character evidence. It became a cautionary tale stripped of emotion, a fragment of precedent in the long chain of English jurisprudence. But to those who had lived through it, the caution was personal, that truth could drown quietly beneath procedure, and that the law, for all its ceremony, could be as indifferent as any crowd. Justice Stephen, the man who had pronounced the sentence, carried his own unease. In private letters to a friend, he admitted that the verdict had troubled him. "I am convinced," he wrote, "that the evidence was legally sufficient, yet I am haunted by the sense that we may have hanged a man whose only crime was to have failed at life." His words were never meant for publication, but they survive in fragments, a faint tremor in the otherwise confident tone of a Victorian judge. His son, James Kenneth Stephen, would later suffer a breakdown that confined him to an asylum, and some would speculate, unfairly perhaps inevitably, that the sins of the father had followed him there. For Kate Lyons, the woman who had once believed in Lipsky's promise, the aftermath was quieter still. She left London soon after the execution, moving to relatives in Leeds. The few surviving letters she wrote in later years mention him only once, in a line that reads, "He was not wicked, only lost." The handwriting wavers, as though even memory had become a burden. In Whitechapel itself, Dina Angel aged quickly. She lived long enough to see the district transformed by the arrival of new immigrants, Russians, Lithuanians, Germans, who filled the same streets with the same hopes and anxieties. Sometimes she would tell her grandchildren about the woman she had once known, a kind, gentle soul who died too young. She never spoke the murderer's name. To her, silence was the only way to keep her daughter-in-law human. As the century turned, the East End began to change. The old tenements crumbled. Factories rose where houses once stood. The past was buried under brick and soot. Yet when social reformers toured the district, writing their reports on the conditions of the poor, they still mentioned the Lipsky case as emblematic of a deeper rot, the moral consequence of overcrowding and neglect. In their narratives, he became the inevitable product of environment, the logical end of poverty. It was an argument both sympathetic and cruel. Sympathetic because it acknowledged that circumstance shapes behavior, cruel because it reduced him to symptom rather than soul. By the time of the First World War, the story had vanished from popular speech. The word Lipsky survived only in the memories of those old enough to recall the days when it had been shouted in anger. In the archives of the Metropolitan Police, the file gathered dust, its pages curling at the edges. The photographs, blurred, gray, and formal, showed faces that no longer looked like people, only evidence. The silence that replaced the noise was not peace, it was forgetfulness. But forgetfulness has its own kind of weight. It presses downward, flattening history until only the outline of events remains. What disappears in the process are the feelings, the small tremors of fear, compassion, doubt, that once gave the story its shape. If one stands today on the narrow strip of pavement where Batty Street once opened onto Commercial Road, it is difficult to imagine what was lost there. The old buildings are gone, replaced by modern flats and a schoolyard. Children play where once a crowd gathered to watch policemen carry out a stretcher. The air smells of exhaust instead of coal smoke. Yet the ground itself has not changed. It still holds the weight of everything built upon it. Cities remember through their stones. They do not forgive. And so the silence that followed the hanging of Israel Lipsky is not absence but endurance. It is the silence of institutions that do not apologize, of streets that outlive their stories, of people who learn to speak of tragedy only when it has lost its names. In that silence lies the real measure of the case, not in guilt or innocence, but in the city's remarkable talent for continuing as though neither mattered. For the living, that was mercy enough. For the dead, it was all that remained. In the decade that followed the hanging of Israel Lipsky, London found new ghosts to feed upon. The city had not grown kinder. It had merely grown larger, hungrier, more complex. The East End, where his story had unfolded, remained the same cramped hive of labor and exhaustion. yet its notoriety deepened, as if the soil had absorbed the shame of every death that took place upon it. By the autumn of 1888, only a year after the execution, another name had begun to ripple through the city's consciousness: Jack the Ripper. His murders took place in the same streets where Miriam Angel had once lived and died. The boundaries between Spitalfields and Whitechapel were thin, invisible lines of soot and poverty. The women who fell victim to the Ripper walked the same alleys, breathed the same fetid air, and depended on the same meager economies that had shaped Miriam's short life. The murders were different in their savagery, but to those who had lived in the district through the Lipsky case, the pattern felt familiar. The fear, the fascination, the way the press descended with appetite disguised as outrage, it was all the same, only louder. Each death was described with a mixture of horror and theatrical precision. The newspapers sold faster when the headlines were cruel. For the Jewish immigrants of Whitechapel, the old unease returned. The Ripper was never identified, and suspicion, by habit and prejudice, fell easily upon the foreigner. The word Lipsky was heard again, shouted in the streets, printed in letters to the editor, whispered by those who had forgotten its origin but not its sting. The name had become shorthand for guilt, the mark of the outsider. In Henriques Street, once Batty Street, the older residents still remembered the summer of 1887. They remembered the black carriage that had carried the doctor, the crowd in the narrow lane, the smell of acid that hung for days. When news spread that another woman had been killed only a few streets away, they spoke of it not as something new, but as something that had never really ended. It began with her. One man said quietly, meaning Miriam Angel, though few listened. The city preferred its horrors separate, its tragedies distinct, but in truth, all were threads in the same fabric of despair. The social reformers came next. They arrived with notebooks and moral purpose, writing about the abyss of the East End. Men like Charles Booth and Henry Mayhew walked the streets, interviewing the poor, categorizing misery into neat statistics. They wrote of rent prices, of child labor, of hunger wages. They drew maps shaded in colors of deprivation, marking the darkest patches where chronic want lived. In their reports, the murder of Miriam Angel appeared as a footnote, an example of domestic depravity among the alien poor. The reformers believed they were rescuing truth from neglect, but even they could not escape the distance of their own class. To them, poverty was a problem to be studied, not a condition to be endured. The victims of that poverty became data points, their suffering turned into moral argument. Lipsky's name resurfaced in their pamphlets, paired with the phrase moral degeneration. It was not cruelty exactly, but something colder, the reduction of tragedy into theory. In these same years, Rabbi Gordon continued his quiet work. He refused to let the story sink entirely into oblivion. From the pulpit, he spoke of teshuvah, repentance, not only as confession of sin but as collective self-examination. He reminded his congregation that evil was never the property of one man alone. When a city starves its people, he said, it must not be surprised when hunger becomes madness. His words were not popular. Respectable men preferred sermons about perseverance and respectability, not guilt. But the rabbi kept speaking, convinced that silence was the more dangerous sin. Meanwhile, in other corners of society, the Lipsky name found darker uses. In taverns and police stations, it was still uttered as insult. A regular Lipsky, some officers said of violent offenders, a label that turned one man's despair into a general symbol of corruption. When a suspect was Jewish, the slur followed easily, as if the crime itself carried a nationality. Thus, the city's language absorbed prejudice without effort, disguising it as folklore. By the mid-1890s, the Ripper murders had ceased, though their mystery remained unsolved. Yet their aftermath ensured that the East End would forever stand as shorthand for poverty and danger. The journalists who had once written of the acid murder now filled their columns with tales of vice and moral decay. The characters changed. The narrative did not. The city needed its scapegoats as much as it needed its workers. The few who still remembered Miriam Angel, and there were not many, recalled her as a figure of gentleness, almost saintly in retrospect. Time had softened her into symbol. Her real voice, her daily worries, her laughter had long since vanished into the anonymity of the dead. Even her husband's rage had cooled into silence. He remarried once, quietly, and moved away from London. His later life was unremarkable, though neighbors said he grew withdrawn, as if part of him still waited for an answer he would never receive. In the official memory of the city, both Miriam and Israel were soon replaced by newer tragedies, but beneath the printed record, their story lingered, not in documents but in mood, in the uneasy sympathy that reformers and writers felt when they described the East End as a breeding ground for crime. Few realized that the crime they feared was not born from evil, but from the same despair that had consumed both victim and killer in that small house on Batty Street. One reformer, W.T. Stead, wrote in 1891, "We are surrounded by a population morally shipwrecked. The tide of destitution has risen until the very pavement reeks of it." He meant it as a warning, but it was also an admission. The city had created its own storms, then expressed surprise at the wreckage. For the working poor, there was no time to reflect. They continued to rise before dawn, to scrub, to sew, to hammer, to haul. The past had no use for them. Only the next day mattered. And yet, even among them, stories survived. Whispered at night when the lamps were low. They spoke of a woman who had smiled even in poverty, and of a man who had been both villain and victim. The story had changed shape, but its heart remained, the fragility of goodness when pressed by need. Toward the end of the century, when the slums began to thin and new buildings rose, the house on Batty Street was finally demolished. The workers who tore it down found nothing unusual, no relic, no stain, no hidden trace of what had happened there. Only old bricks, old plaster, and the faint smell of damp. The past had retreated into the ground. But London, being what it is, never truly lets go of its ghosts. They persist not in walls or bones, but in the habits of thought, the quiet prejudices that travel from one generation to the next. The word Lipsky would reappear now and then, stripped of meaning, surviving as an echo without source. A sound that once named both guilt and grief, now merely an empty vibration of the air. And in that transformation lay the essence of the city itself, its ability to take pain and turn it into language, to take a life and turn it into legend, to turn legend finally into nothing at all. Because in the end, London does not remember out of conscience. It remembers because forgetting would require stillness, and stillness in a city that never sleeps is the one mercy it cannot afford. By the closing years of the 19th century, the city that had once shouted Lipsky in anger had grown older, and in some ways, more sophisticated. Electric lights had begun to replace gas. The horse carts shared the streets with early motor cars. Yet beneath the new gleam, the old unease endured. The East End was still a geography of want, its narrow lanes pressed between warehouses and factories that paid starvation wages. The social reformers had mapped its poverty, the preachers had moralized it, and the novelists had romanticized it. But none had dispelled the sense that something unresolved lingered there, a question that refused to die with the century. That question was not who had killed Miriam Angel, but why London had needed to believe in the guilt of Israel Lipsky so completely, so quickly. The case had become, in retrospect, a mirror of the city's own anxieties. To admit uncertainty was to admit that justice itself might falter, that the empire's faith in law and order was as fragile as the lives of the poor it judged. And so the story, once buried, began to resurface, not in the gossip of markets, but in the measured tones of writers and scholars who were beginning to doubt the infallibility of the institutions they had inherited. The new field of criminology was taking shape. Men like Cesare Lombroso and Henry Mayhew wrote of inherited criminal types, of faces and skulls that betrayed moral degeneracy. British thinkers translated these ideas into their own moral vocabulary. They studied photographs of convicts, measuring ears and jaws, searching for signs that wickedness could be read like handwriting. Among the examples cited in early textbooks, the Lipski case appeared briefly, as evidence, some claimed, of the hysterical cunning of the foreign criminal. Others, more skeptical, used it to illustrate the danger of such theories, a reminder that character and circumstance could not be neatly separated by science or law. In 1901, a retired magistrate named Edmund Dawson Rogers published a pamphlet titled Miscarriages of Justice in Our Courts of Law. One of its chapters revisited the execution of Israel Lipski. Rogers, a rational man steeped in the Victorian belief in progress, found himself troubled by the case's contradictions. He noted the language barrier, the rushed proceedings, the confused evidence. If guilt, he wrote, be measured not by proof but by prejudice, then the gallows becomes but another form of superstition. His words drew little attention at the time, but they marked the beginning of a quiet shift in how society remembered such crimes, not as moral certainties, but as moral wounds. The newspapers, too, began to change their tone. The sensationalism of the 1880s gave way to a new appetite for analysis. The Pall Mall Gazette ran a reflective piece in 1904 entitled Lessons from the East End Murders. Beneath the sober heading, the journalist suggested that the tragedy of Lipski and Angel was not unique, but systemic. The law punished the symptom, he wrote, while the disease, the unrelieved degradation of our urban poor, remains unexamined. It was an unusual admission for a paper that once had demanded the man's death. Yet by then, London's conscience had begun to stir. Still, the city preferred its doubts abstract. It could acknowledge error in principle, so long as it did not have to confront the faces of those who had suffered from it. The dead were easier to pity when they remained nameless. And so the Lipski case was discussed as an idea, a lesson in judicial haste, a moral allegory, rather than as the intertwined ruin of two ordinary lives. Miriam Angel and her unborn child, Israel Lipski, and his broken body beneath the rope. They were no longer people, only examples. Among those who studied the trial transcripts was a young writer named Arthur Machen, later known for his strange tales of guilt and revelation. He noted in his diary that evil is not a deed, but a contagion. The phrase could have applied equally to the East End. For Machen and his generation, the story of Lipski was less a crime than a parable of infection, the infection of despair, of poverty, of moral fatigue. The city itself had become the criminal, its architecture a labyrinth that bred secrecy and decay. In the years between the Boer War and the First World War, nostalgia for the simpler Victorian era grew fashionable. The nation looked back on its past with selective sentimentality, polishing its tragedies until they seemed instructive. In this process, the story of Miriam Angel softened into a cautionary tale about vice, and Israel Lipski hardened into stereotype. It was easier that way. A society that prized order could not bear to remember that its order sometimes required innocent blood, yet not everyone accepted the comfort of amnesia. Rabbi Gordon, now old and frail, gave a final sermon in 1909 in which he spoke once more of the case that had haunted his ministry. He reminded his congregation that repentance was not only the duty of individuals, but of nations. A just people, he said, must remember its errors not as shame, but as warning. Those who attended recalled that he wept while speaking, a rare thing for a man of learning. He died a few months later, his notes found neatly folded in the margin of his prayer book. On one page he had written in Yiddish, "Mercy is the shadow cast by doubt." By then, doubt had become the currency of a new age. The faith in reason that had carried Britain through its empire was beginning to crack under the weight of its contradictions. Industrial progress coexisted with slums, scientific triumphs with hunger. The courtroom, once a stage for moral certainty, now seemed another theater of human confusion. The case of Lipski, once invoked to demonstrate the efficiency of justice, was increasingly cited to question it. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the noise of modern catastrophe drowned out the faint echo of that older tragedy. Yet even as shells fell over Europe, the lesson of the East End lingered in the minds of reformers. After the war, as governments spoke of reconstruction and equality, they looked back upon the 19th century as an age of both achievement and blindness. In that retrospective light, the story of the murdered woman and the condemned immigrant became emblematic of a society that could build railways across continents, yet failed to recognize the humanity of its own poor. By the early 1920s, criminologists revisiting Victorian cases began to speak of Lipski as a probable miscarriage of justice. They cited inconsistencies, the influence of prejudice, and the unexamined witness statements. None could prove innocence, yet none could rest easy with guilt. The case had become a vessel for uncertainty, an object lesson in how truth dissolves under pressure. The irony was that, in being reconsidered so many times, it achieved a kind of immortality. Doubt, it seemed, could preserve memory better than belief ever could. And so, more than 30 years after the last echo of the gallows had faded, the name that once signified corruption began to signify caution. To call someone a Lipski was no longer to condemn. It was to warn against haste, to remind that law without empathy is merely another instrument of power. The slur had begun, slowly, to turn into a mirror. By then, no one alive could remember the faces of Miriam Angel or Israel Lipski as they truly were. They existed only in photographs and footnotes, their humanity reconstructed through the language of others. Yet their story remained, a thread of unease running beneath the grand narrative of progress. It whispered that guilt and innocence are not opposites, but reflections, that the search for certainty, in law or in life, is often the beginning of cruelty. And in that whisper lay the enduring lesson of the East End, a reminder that the anatomy of doubt is, perhaps, the only honest form of understanding the human soul. Time does not erase, it layers. Each generation adds its own dust, its own noise, until what once was clear becomes buried beneath the quiet weight of ordinary living. The city learns to forget by continuing, by turning suffering into scenery. By the middle of the 20th century, London had rebuilt itself so many times that the East End seemed less like a place than a palimpsest. Old lines faintly visible beneath new ones, the ghosts of slums half remembered beneath the post-war brick. The Lipski case had long since passed out of common speech. Its details, once debated in drawing rooms and taverns alike, survived only in the archives. Folded court transcripts, yellowed clippings, a few grainy illustrations. To most, it was just another relic of the Victorian underworld, one among countless tragedies catalogued under notable murders. But every forgotten story leaves a residue, something that clings to the places and people it once touched. That residue is harder to see, but it lingers. In the way the city talks about its poor, in the faces it chooses to remember, and in the crimes it decides are worth retelling. The years between the wars changed London's relationship to its past. The Great War had rewritten the moral landscape. Grief was no longer the burden of a few, but the shared condition of millions. In that collective mourning, individual tragedies lost their edges. Even the East End, once synonymous with danger and vice, now seemed merely another part of a wounded city. The bombs of the Blitz would later flatten what poverty and prejudice had left standing. The very streets where Miriam Angel had walked were shattered, their histories scattered with the rubble. When the air raids came, the old lanes around Whitechapel burned through the night. The names of the dead filled columns in the newspapers, long lists printed small enough to fit beside reports from the front. Few noticed when the address 16 Batty Street appeared among them, the same number, though not the same building, destroyed in 1940. For a moment the past and present had crossed, the ghosts collapsing into the living city once more. But in war, such coincidences passed without comment. London had grown used to tragedy. After the war, the East End began to change. Immigrant families arrived from places far beyond Europe, India, the Caribbean, later Bangladesh. The old tenements gave way to new estates, and the working-class life that had defined the district began to dissolve into something different. To the new arrivals, the name Lipski meant nothing. The story had become a local myth that no longer belonged to anyone. The few historians who remembered it found it difficult to separate fact from invention. So many versions had been told that the truth itself seemed an afterthought. And yet, the moral of the story, that thin thread of unease about justice and judgment, continued to weave through the city's consciousness. It reappeared in unexpected places, in television dramas about wrongful convictions, in essays about the limits of punishment, in quiet conversations among lawyers who still debated whether the system could ever truly be fair. The faces had changed, but the question had not. When the sociologists of the 1950s returned to study the East End, they described it not as dangerous, but as resilient. Their reports, written in the language of welfare and reconstruction, spoke of community spirit and social renewal. But beneath the optimism, the old hierarchies remained. The poor were still objects of observation, their stories filtered through the eyes of those who measured them. The same dispassionate tone that once filled court records now filled government reports. Progress, it seemed, was just another way of renaming distance. By the 1960s, when Britain began to look back on its Victorian past with nostalgia, the age of steam, of empire, of strict morality, the Lipski case resurfaced once more, this time in the pages of popular history. It appeared in anthologies of true crime, between tales of poisoners and forgers, stripped of context and reduced to curiosity. The tone was detached, faintly amused. The writers described the case as peculiar, gruesome, typical of its time. The woman and the man had become characters again. The living complexity of their suffering flattened into narrative entertainment. In one such volume, published in 1968, a single sentence summarized the story. A Polish Jew named Israel Lipski murdered a pregnant woman with nitric acid and was hanged for his crime. No mention of doubt, of prejudice, of the chaos of that small tenement room. Just a line, efficient, final, empty. It was the kind of forgetting that masquerades as memory, neat, orderly, and wrong. But in quieter corners, others still asked questions. A young historian named Leonard Woolgar, researching police procedures of the 1880s, found the trial transcript and wrote an article titled "The Lipski Confession Reconsidered." Published in a minor journal in 1972, it argued that the supposed confession could not be verified, that it had likely been paraphrased rather than written in Lipski's own hand. The article went largely unnoticed, but it marked a subtle shift. The story, long dismissed as closed, began to breathe again. Doubt, once buried, has a way of surviving in the margins. In the decades that followed, London itself became a museum of its own contradictions. The East End turned fashionable. Artists and students moved into old warehouses, once filled with dock workers. Cafes replaced sweatshops, and the very poverty that had once repelled the wealthy became part of the city's aesthetic. But gentrification, like justice, has its blind spots. Beneath the painted brick and polished glass, the earth still held the bones of those who had died unseen. Their names, if remembered at all, were footnotes on plaques that few stopped to read. It was in those years that a filmmaker, a quiet, meticulous man named Alan Desmond, began work on a documentary about forgotten crimes of the Victorian poor. Among the stories he uncovered was that of Miriam Angel. He visited what remained of Henriques Street, filming the narrow pavements, the empty spaces where houses had once stood. He read the old testimonies aloud in his measured voice. the doctor's calm description, the landlord's confusion, the accused man's final words. "I innocent. I did not do this." When the film was released on public television in 1983, it received modest attention. But for some viewers, it was the first time they had heard the story told without malice. The narration ended not with condemnation, but with silence. A lingering shot of a single window, reflecting nothing but gray London sky. And perhaps that was fitting, because by then, the case no longer belonged to the machinery of crime or punishment. It belonged to the city's moral memory, that fragile space between history and myth, where forgotten lives continue to ask their unanswered questions. Even now, in archives and libraries, the folders marked Lipski sit quietly among thousands of others, the paper brittle, the ink fading. The clerks who handle them rarely notice the irony that the name, once shouted in hatred, now rests in an institution dedicated to preservation. Time, with its slow impartiality, has granted what mercy the law could not: obscurity. To walk through the East End today is to feel that mercy and that erasure intertwined. The streets are cleaner, the accents different, but the rhythm of endurance remains the same. Markets still open before dawn. The smell of bread and oil still fills the air. Somewhere beneath the noise of traffic and conversation, beneath the centuries of rebuilding and forgetting, the story still moves faintly. Not as guilt, not as legend, but as a small pulse of empathy, a reminder that even the condemned once had a heartbeat, because a city never truly forgets. It only learns to speak its memory in quieter tones. Every city carries its share of ghosts, but London's are patient. They do not haunt in the obvious way. They settle into the cracks of pavements, into the weathered edges of doors, into the slow rhythm of footsteps repeating across generations. Some are remembered because they are famous, most because they once frightened the living. Yet the ghosts that linger longest are those who were misunderstood. They return not to accuse, but to remind. And in that sense, Israel Lipski and Miriam Angel have never entirely left. In the quiet of modern London, the story survives only in fragments. A scholar might find it in the brittle paper of an archive. A passerby might see it referenced in a footnote. A tourist might glimpse the name on a heritage trail of forgotten crimes. Each encounter is brief, almost accidental, like overhearing a conversation from another century. The details are easy to recall: the acid, the bed, the locked door. But the meaning remains evasive. What is left to learn from a tragedy so old, so buried beneath the city's progress? Perhaps it begins with the realization that nothing ever truly ends. The execution that once seemed final has continued to echo in subtler forms, in every discussion about fairness, in every trial where accent or poverty tilts the scales, in every whisper of doubt that follows the word justice. The rope that closed around Lipski's neck has long turned to dust, yet the pattern it represents, the rush to judgment, the comfort of certainty, remains woven into society's fabric. We call it efficiency. We call it order. It still kills, only more quietly. The historian walking through what was once Batty Street finds no trace of the house now. The ground has been repaved, the skyline altered by steel and glass. Children play where the courtyard once lay. A school wall hides what used to be the narrow entryway to the old tenement. Yet if one stands there long enough, listening beyond the traffic, there is a peculiar stillness in the air, as if the city itself is aware that something was once demanded of it that it never truly answered. The questions remain suspended, unanswered but not forgotten. Why her? Why him? Why then? Why so easily believed? The philosopher might say the story reveals the machinery of class. The psychologist might call it a study in desperation. But stripped of analysis, it is simply the story of a woman who wanted to live and a man who wanted not to fail. Both were swallowed by forces larger than themselves: poverty, prejudice, and the human need to find closure even when truth is uncertain. The law could only name one guilty, but the city itself was the accomplice. It provided the conditions, the silence, the hunger, and then looked away. After the war and the rebuilding, London became proud of its tolerance. The rhetoric changed. The habits did not. The descendants of the same immigrants who once crowded the East End now filled its hospitals, its markets, its taxis. The word foreigner softened, but did not disappear. When newspapers wrote about crime in the poorer districts, their tone echoed that of 1887. Cleaner prose, perhaps, but the same suspicion, the same weary refrain about certain communities. Progress, like amnesia, works in cycles. In the 1990s, a historian at Queen Mary University unearthed the coroner's records and decided to re-examine the evidence. Her research, published quietly under the title A Victorian Miscarriage, concluded that Lipsky's confession was likely coerced and that the physical evidence would not have met modern forensic standards. The article sparked brief discussion, a few radio interviews, then faded again beneath the tide of newer tragedies. But it mattered. For a moment, the balance shifted. The name regained a human contour. It was no longer only a slur or a symbol. It belonged once more to a man who had lived, erred, and died, believing himself misunderstood. The larger moral of the story, though, lies not in guilt or innocence, but in the way societies build distance between themselves and their victims. It is easier to speak of the murderer or the case than of Miriam Angel waking to her last morning, or Israel Lipsky standing on the scaffold with his lips moving in a prayer no one could hear. Distance grants safety, but that safety, multiplied over centuries, becomes indifference, the quiet cruelty of the comfortable. We call it civilization. Still, the city remembers in small ways. A local historian once placed a single white flower on the site of the old house each June 28th, the date of Miriam's death. He left no note, no plaque, only the gesture itself. Sometimes it was crushed by passing feet within hours. Sometimes it remained for days, browning slowly in the rain. Acts of memory, like acts of mercy, are fragile things. They persist not through monuments but through repetition. One person after another deciding, quietly, not to let the silence close completely. In recent years, the story has found a new audience. True crime enthusiasts, historians of class and migration, students of justice, all drawn to the strangeness of it, the proximity to the Whitechapel murders, the tragic intimacy of the locked room discovery. They approach it with fascination, yet some also with reverence. For in its slow unfolding lies something universal, the recognition that tragedy is not spectacle, but reflection. Each retelling becomes less about the crime and more about the condition that allowed it, the loneliness of crowded cities, the fragility of kindness when survival is the only virtue. If one listens closely, the story offers its own form of penance. It asks nothing but attention. It asks that the dead be seen not as lessons, but as lives, that justice be understood not as punishment, but as patience, that history, when it speaks, be heard not for its drama, but for its warning. To retell it is to practice remembrance as a moral act, a quiet resistance to the erasures that time prefers. And so, after all the retellings and reevaluations, after the debates and footnotes, what remains is not the question of what happened in that small room on Batty Street, but the larger truth that every city must confront, that civilization is built upon selective memory, and that every forgotten injustice leaves a faint, enduring tremor in the foundations. Perhaps that is why, even now when night falls over Whitechapel and the air hangs heavy with the scent of rain and iron, one can almost feel the pulse of that earlier London. The horses, the cries, the lamplight trembling on wet stone. The sound seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, like breathing. It is the city remembering itself. The murder of Miriam Angel and the execution of Israel Lipsky are no longer mysteries to be solved. They are mirrors, reflecting our oldest contradiction, the need to believe in justice and the fear that justice, once believed, can so easily become cruelty. What remains is the invitation to doubt, to feel, to remember. And in that remembering, in that quiet reckoning, the dead finally rest, not absolved, but understood.